Welcome everyone. Very excited to see everyone here. We have, I think, close to 200 people online as well, so no pressure to our speakers that are local here. By the way, for the folks online, if you have questions during the program, please ask, and we will be monitoring the chat. So my name is Mark Gardner. It's great to meet you. I'm with Gardner Law. And just again, very excited to be here, not only because it's like 40 degrees and I think 20-mile-per-hour winds in Minnesota, but very lovely to be here on Huntington Beach where it's 70 and sunny. So that's a big improvement. So the program today is Mastering Tomorrow's Tech, a cutting edge approach to compliance, regulatory, and privacy regulations. So I was talking with Danny. If you don't mind, I'll pick on you right away, Danny, who is actually an AI expert here in the audience. And one of his comments was, it's nice to get kind of a cross-disciplinary approach to this new amazing thing that we have, AI, machine learning, et cetera. I feel like I'm like Katie Couric and Matt Lauer explaining what the internet is in like 1993, if you've ever seen that hot take on the internet back then. But yeah, just, today we're going to be focusing on the law, of course, and the regulations related to getting the products approved, some of the compliance aspects. If you're providing an AI technology of some sort to your customers, is that a potential kickback issue or false claims issue? And then, of course, the cyber and privacy aspects are heavily embedded with these new technologies. So again, it's great to talk about, for us, the kind of regulatory nerds here, to talk about all of the legal aspects. We'll also be looking at things not only from a US perspective, but also a European perspective. We have two esteemed colleagues visiting from Germany that will cover regulatory and privacy aspects as well. I'll provide just a couple quick anecdotes and then hand it over to Amanda. I also, just from a housekeeping standpoint, if you want to be on camera, just walk up the middle aisle here and wave to anyone online because the camera's back there. So in all seriousness, maybe if you're having a talk or something, you just want to stay out of the way of the camera, that'd be great. The program will go until 12:30. We have a panel discussion with some guests from Medtronic, Glaukos, and Edwards. So thank you to our guests who are here, and I'll introduce them later. So from about when I'm done here up till 10 a.m. local time, we'll be talking about compliance. Then we'll be getting into the privacy and cyber aspects from 10 to 10:45. We'll then have a 15-minute break until 11. We'll then talk about some of the FDA and MDR related issues around regulations in the US and Europe, which will take us up to about noon, 11:45 or noon. And then we'll have our panel discussion. I have some questions prepared for the panel. This program is being recorded. It will be available later, and as well as the slides. So if you need anything, if you have any questions about that, let us know. And it's also, eligible for if you're an attorney, you're eligible for 3 credits. They've been approved through Minnesota, and then you'll need to check with your local authorities on what they'll provide, but we do provide a CLE certificate to self-report. And I'll just make a couple more comments and hand it over to Amanda. So I've been on the speaking circuit a little bit lately. I was out in DC the last couple of weeks and in Seattle before that, and talked about AI at each program. And so I've done quite a bit of research on the topic. There's actually 700 devices that have been cleared through July by the FDA or approved. And the first one was approved in 1995. So they're out there already. Of course, they're getting more and more sophisticated with, most recently we have, you can go on Google and ask Bard questions, things like that, right? Where I could ask Danny again to give an overview of this, but you can actually ask AI to do things for you now. That wasn't true in 1995, of course. But the point is, this technology is out there already. We're seeing it in radiology. About 87% of those devices that are on the market are radiology related. About 7% are cardiovascular, and the rest make up like neurology, ophthalmic devices, and others. One story, there was an article in the New York Times, if you can catch it, from last week. It was really good. There was a physician doing a telehealth visit online, and he started to feel like he was having a stroke. So he went to the hospital, and they had an AI triage device that identified a clot in his brain in about a second. So he had a CT scan. Instead of having a radiologist read 1,000 pictures, the algorithm, the AI figured it out immediately. And he then went to a medical center to have surgery, and he was back practicing in his office the following week. So that's an example of, mind-blowing success of AI. University of Michigan, I'll just kind of paint both pictures, did a study on a sepsis-related technology, and it turned out it was supposed to predict sepsis in patients, and it was right about 12% of the time. So the devices, this technology obviously is not infallible, but I do think it presents tremendous potential, as I'm sure you all do too. Sometimes I think about this as just being the skeptical lawyer. Is this another gold rush? Is this, sorry, Mark Zuckerberg, is this the next metaverse? I never really figured that out. Is this crypto? I think Bitcoin's kind of succeeded, but you have other people going to prison for 120 years. I think Sam is facing a pretty long prison sentence. Is it 3D printing, which I think has its place, but it's not like 3D printing everything in our lives. So sometimes we get really excited, about things. Wall Street does. I don't know if AI is that yet, or if it's the next, again, microchip or PC. We'll see. With that, have a great time today. Ask questions, please engage. And Amanda, I will hand it over to you.
Hello. Hello. Okay, it's working. Thanks, Mark. And I'll just echo Mark's comments. It's great to be here, and it's great to see so many people in person. It's awesome. But I'm going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, which is compliance. Well, maybe it's just my favorite. If I can get it to go. The clicker's not working. Oh, that was Mark's slide. More slides from Mark. All right, here I am. For those who I haven't met, and we can chat later. I look forward to meeting everybody and catching up. But my name is Amanda Johnston, and I'm a managing attorney at the firm. And I have been at the firm for 4.5 years, but primarily most of my career has been in-house at medical device companies. So I worked in legal, regulatory, and compliance at a variety of companies. And at the firm, I split my practice, which is a little unusual, but I do a lot of compliance. So compliance programs, advising on commercial programs, but I also do regulatory strategy submission, interacting with FDA, that kind of stuff, just because I have that kind of a mixed background, which is unique. But today I'm going to be talking about compliance primarily, and we'll hear a little bit more about the FDA regulatory side later this morning. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of intersection between healthcare compliance and medical technology, which a lot of people don't think about when you're thinking about, tech, high-tech stuff. First, I'll give an overview of some of the applicable laws and just other doctrines that apply in the space that may be implicated. And then there's a kind of a variety of special topics that I'm going to dive into that come up or seem to come up more often when it comes to high-tech healthcare. All right. So these are just some examples of what we consider, or what kind of I'm considering today in terms of high-tech healthcare. This is a very small sampling, but there's just been an explosion of technology in the medical healthcare space that either patients use, physicians use, and there's robotic surgeries, there's tons of wearables, there's sensors, there's patient monitoring. Mark talked about the image analysis, which I think has been the diagnostic imaging has been really the majority of kind of AI high-tech healthcare thus far. But now we're seeing, obviously telemedicine has been huge the last couple of years, and that will continue to proliferate, I believe. But yeah, just kind of an idea of just a variety of applications in which kind of this high tech can apply in the medical healthcare space. So it's a very, excuse me, a lot of variety. And if you think about, you know, the state of consumer electronics and consumer tech, we've seen a huge explosion, huge growth in that area over the last 10 years. And I just thought this was interesting. So the global wearable medical device market, so as of this year, it was $40 billion, and it's supposed to reach $156 billion globally. So it just shows that it is going to continue to increase, and we're going to have just kind of more and more exposure to the space, and then as well, it will inform us in terms of where kind of the compliance risks are. You can see that the diagnostic space is the majority, and it looks like it's anticipated to maintain that over the next 10 years or so. But also home therapy and wearable therapy and patient monitoring is going to be a piece of that as well. And I thought this was interesting. So North America outpaces the rest of the world by far on the growth of the wearable medical device market. I think Europe was second. I'll let Cord and Oliver weigh in on that, but I anticipate it will catch on, but the North American region has been really the driver of the majority of the growth in this space. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more about the laws, which is kind of the boring part, but it's good to have the background, and I can kind of talk a little bit about each of these and how they potentially will be implicated by high-tech healthcare, connected healthcare, AI, that kind of stuff. So anti-kickback statute, so it is one of the main federal healthcare fraud and abuse laws in the United States. And it is a criminal law that really prohibits the exchange of anything of value to induce a reward referral for generation of federal healthcare business. So there are safe harbors. So if you structure an arrangement that provides remuneration in a way that meets the safe harbor, it's protected from prosecution. And really the purpose is to prevent physicians from making medical decisions based on what they're getting of value from the industry or someone else, I guess. Penalties are high. A lot of the settlements you see are both AKS and False Claims Act, so we'll talk about that in a second. But I guess the main point is fines are really large, and you would be excluded from participating in federal healthcare programs in the future. So this is really kind of the main thing that we're looking at as we look at services, benefits, values, provision of those kind of remunerative streams. And the Federal False Claims Act is the other main federal healthcare fraud and abuse law. And the False Claims Act is violated when false claims for reimbursement are submitted to the government. This is broader than just healthcare, but manufacturers, so medical device manufacturers or pharma companies can be liable if they cause a false claim. So if they're sharing false or misleading information related to how the product's coded or reimbursed or how it functions, they could be liable under the False Claims Act as well. And a kickback also, if an arrangement is deemed to be a kickback under the anti-kickback statute, it also will violate the False Claims Act. So a lot of the times you'll see really big settlements in this area because you'll have False Claims Act plus anti-kickback statute liability, and you can see how the claims could really, the number of claims, the fines are per claim, and it depends on the amount of the claim and the amount of remuneration, so it can get really high up there and into the billions. And again, this is a mandatory exclusion under the False Claims Act. All right, Stark. We are not Stark experts because this is primarily not applicable in the medical device industry, pharmaceutical industry, but wanted to pay mention as it relates to DME suppliers and kind of that high-tech healthcare that we've seen shift into the DME space. So Stark, basically, they're looking at the financial arrangements between a physician and an entity that they are referring patients to. So the purpose is to prevent doctors from referring patients to an entity for a service where they actually have a financial relationship with. Fines, exclusion. I think that's, yeah, and there's certain, it only applies to certain designated healthcare services, which is laboratory services, I think DME, there's a bunch listed in the statute. But it does come up in the DME space, so I'll reference it briefly shortly here. And then we also have the CMP law, and there's a portion of the CMP law that relates specifically to beneficiary inducements. So under the CMP law, they are allowed to impose fines, basically, against any person who offers or transfers remuneration, so really anything of value, to a federal healthcare program beneficiary that the person knows or should know is likely to induce them to select a specific provider, practitioner, or supplier. It's a really mouthful of a definition there. But essentially, if a company is giving something to a Medicare beneficiary, whether it's something free, whether it's a free product, free service, the CMP law is implicated. So the assessment must be done as well. All right. And then one that comes up a lot but isn't really codified in federal law is the corporate practice of medicine doctrine. So there's actually 33 states that have laws that restrict the corporate practice of medicine. And there are most states, if you think about it, have exceptions for professional corporations, but essentially the rule is that corporations cannot practice medicine and they can't employ a physician to practice medicine. But if you think about it, if there's exceptions from, maybe there's a private practice clinic, there are exceptions as long as you're meeting those exceptions for those types of professional entities. But essentially, the purpose, or I guess the goals of this doctrine, are to prevent the commercialization of the practice of medicines. There's been a lot of pushback in terms of, we don't want it to become a commercial endeavor, although some could argue that it kind of already is. But really, I think the main purpose is, if you think about it, a corporation's main goal is to make money, and physicians, they have duties to their patients and duties to provide healthcare, and those goals don't always align. So this is something that comes up in the context a lot with clinical decision support tools and kind of AI, if you're aiding a healthcare provider in making a determination as to the treatment approach or a diagnosis. So this comes up quite a bit. And obviously this doctrine kind of aligns or intersects with FDA's regulations on how they handle and classify medical devices that do those things, but it's just something else to think about because it's another potential area of risk for the company. All right, so now we're going to talk just a little bit about some of the specific areas where these laws come up and where they potentially intersect with high-tech healthcare. All right, so the first one, payment reimbursement. So obviously, if you are developing a device that has a new technology or high tech or AI or machine learning, one of the very first things that the development team should think about is how you're going to get paid for it. So are you going to have self-pay options? Are you going to seek insurance coverage? And this is something that can be particularly challenging when it comes to new technologies and innovative products where, our existing coding structure and policies maybe don't even cover it. So just something to think about at a high level. I have a cheat sheet here because there's a bunch of programs that CMS has proposed that I would encourage companies to look into that basically are intended to help facilitate patient access to these new and innovative technologies by reducing some of the financial burden for adoption. So it's kind of an alphabet soup here, but I'll just name them off. So there's the new technology add-on payments, NTAP, transitional pass-through payments, transitional payments for new and innovative equipment and supplies. And then there was recently a proposed rule for the TSET program, which is transitional coverage of emerging technologies. So these types of programs should really be something that's addressed and considered very early on. in the development process, kind of alongside maybe the FDA Breakthrough Device Program as well. So just something to keep on the radar, because it absolutely, payment and reimbursement can be a huge challenge to companies that don't proactively address those concerns once you get to market. So there's insurance billing, there's a potential for rental or loan arrangements. A lot of the products that we've seen lately or seen coming up relate to maybe a capital or small capital equipment with refills, or something that you have to continually buy, but then there's also a capital purchase. So just thinking about how that's going to be, how is that, are you going to, who's going to refill who's going to, write a prescription for the refill, and what are the medical necessity requirements around that? So there's just a lot of things to think about. And then patient inducement considerations. So are we giving anything to the patient for free? Are there products or anything that we are providing of value that we're not paying, that we're not getting payment for? And then just along the same lines of False Claims Act, what I talked about with the liability, is the company sharing correct and accurate reimbursement information? So if there are these, NTAP pass-through payments, is the company appropriately sharing that information such that the provider is able to bill accurately? All right. So switching gears a little bit, but just another way to think of programs is just, is there a product or service that is of value to either the provider or the patient? So kind of follow the money, but also follow where there's not money being collected and there is value being provided. So a lot of the times with these high-tech connected devices, there will be some sort of monitoring or information flow back to the healthcare provider. So just thinking about, does that monitoring provide something of value? Is that taking away something that the doctor was previously doing, such that it could be interpreted as a transfer of value under the AKS? That analysis should be done, just kind of following where the benefits are going. If you're giving something to the patient for free or helping them with services or product offerings, obviously we'd have to do the assessment under the Civil Monetary Penalties Law for beneficiary inducement. And then along the lines of what I talked about with corporate practice of medicine, is there a technology using artificial intelligence or machine learning that could potentially, cross the line into practicing medicine? All right, so talk a little bit about DME, although this is a huge topic in and of itself, and we could probably do an entire course or program on this topic. But traditionally we think of DME and we think of wheelchairs, walkers, kind of, not high-tech stuff. But we've recently seen, over the last 10 years or so, a lot of technology is being introduced in the DME space. And that, creates some challenges from a billing compliance perspective. DMEPO's, the quality standards, aren't really written for, they're not intended or drafted for kind of high-tech products. So just, something to think about. We're seeing a lot of manufacturers that are in the DME space. So they are operating both as a DME and a device manufacturer. And that creates challenges in terms of, keeping those roles separate and billing. I mean, obviously then you're billing directly to Medicare, Medicaid. So that implicates the False Claims Act directly, which is a risk area. All right, and then cybersecurity, which we'll hear a little bit more about later as well, but just wanted to point out that in 2021, the DOJ announced its civil cyber fraud initiative. So anytime you have a connected device, which really is, if it connects to the internet and is, processing data, be very proactive about your cybersecurity protocols, because now the DOJ has said that they intend to use the False Claims Act to hold entities and individuals accountable for products or services where there's deficient cybersecurity, whether it's knowingly misrepresenting their cybersecurity protocols or failing to monitor and report issues. So I anticipate that this will be used more as a penalty for cybersecurity. And again, if you remember, it's exclusion is one of the penalties, but also just fines, treble fines. All right, so something else that has come up, telemedicine has exploded over the last, especially since COVID, and there's been a lot of flexibility in the laws and regulations around telemedicine that continues today. But something to think about is we've seen a lot of companies trying to accommodate the patients' and consumers' desire to do everything remotely. So there are a lot of teleprescriber services or telemedicine services where you don't have to leave your house. I mean, I'm guilty. I love using those. I'd rather do those than go into the doctor's office or the urgent care. But we've seen a lot more than companies that contract with these telemedicine providers to provide these services to patients. So it's just a good area to think about because the DOJ is very interested in telemedicine fraud and other aspects of fraud and abuse. So they have a special fraud alert that I won't go through in detail, but if you are in this space, I encourage you to look at it and keep up to date on the evolving enforcement trends in this area. But essentially, they're looking at patient recruitment strategies. So who is finding the patients? Are they compensating based on the number of patients? Does the telemedicine provider actually have a meaningful contact with the patient enough to determine medical necessity? These kinds of things. So you can see how you'd want to make sure if you're going to engage with a telemedicine provider that they're actually providing legitimate services and having enough contact with the patient and maybe their medical record to actually, order or prescribe a product. All right, then clinical lab testing. So this has kind of always been a hot issue for the DOJ. It's always received a little bit of heightened scrutiny, but just wanted to point it out as well, especially when combined with telemedicine prescribing. So often you'll see a telemedicine prescriber ordering a test so that it's done, really completely out of the doctor's office, which can be done legitimately, but it is an area of increased scrutiny where, unnecessary testing, lack of medical necessity, overcharging, those types of issues that could come up. So key takeaways, and I kind of jumped around a lot just to cover quite a few topics today that just bring up compliance considerations with AI and connected high-tech device. But really implementing a comprehensive compliance program, and you want to address really all of the legal, regulatory, and ethical considerations, but having a cross-functional collaboration really between all the stakeholders is going to be key going into as we move forward into this world where high-tech connected AI, ML is going to be kind of just the standard, the norm. And really having that IT collaboration along with medical and legal is going to be critical. Stay informed. So I know a lot of people are kind of like, oh, AI, I don't use it, I don't want to use it, but it's being used. If you're at a company and you don't have a policy on AI and how it can be used, that's something that you should think about, because if you're not using it, somebody at the company is. And even if you have a policy that it's restricted, somebody in your supply chain is probably using it. So it's good to think ahead, stay on top of that, have a stance, and just stay informed on the developments. And then just pay attention to risk areas. So these are changing. It should be part of your really annual risk assessment process. But thinking about coding and billing, obviously where the government hooks are from an enforcement perspective. So billing, the ordering and prescribing practice. If you're developing a device, practicing medicine versus aiding healthcare professionals and making decisions, keeping that line clear because it can be very blurry. And then following the money in terms of, if who are you paying or who's paying, but also where is their value being provided in the product, work stream where there's payment is not being collected. So those are just some high level, and I could probably go into detail on each of these topics for an hour, but just wanted to give you guys a quick overview of kind of the evolving compliance considerations that come up in the high-tech space. Are there any questions? Yes. Oh, do we want to get him the mic? I don't know if I can answer your question.
Does this work? Hello?
Yep, I can hear
It's
you.
all good.
Yep.
My question is, so thanks for the talk, very
Yeah.
insightful. On the cybersecurity front, if I give you a case study, I was wondering if you could shed light on that. I mean, a lot of people in the AI world do things on Amazon Web Services, so AWS.
Yep.
They come in with their own cybersecurity defenses. My question is, if I were to do something through AWS, data monitoring, storage,
Yep.
and so forth, am I held liable for their deficiencies in their cybersecurity as a startup or a company and so forth?
Good question. I'm probably not the best person to answer, but Paul might be a better person. But essentially, what I understand is that part of the risk assessment will include AWS's cybersecurity protocols. And then if the company is relying on them solely without, checking or verifying or not having their own controls, then that potentially could be an issue where you might have liability. I would save the question for Paul.
Sounds good.
Because
Thank
he
you.
can speak more intelligently on it.
Is this working?
Oh, yeah.
Great. Yeah, I mean, to echo what Amanda said, it's definitely a shared responsibility whenever you have a third party involved. AWS, obviously everyone's using AWS or Azure or something like that, in these spaces. So there's a lot of dependence on those
Mhm.
security protocols. But, it's a sandbox. There's a lot that you can do internally to manage controls within those third parties and oversight. So a little bit of both. There's definitely some liability on both sides.
Yep, go ahead.
There's a question online from Lisa Laro. Would engaging in a relationship with a vendor that sells a product to a patient in which the physician had invested and has advisory shares be in violation of AKA?
Well, that's a good question. I can't give legal advice with just that little information. I think it's definitely something that should be looked into, both from a Stark and AKS perspective. Contact us later will help. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to hand it over to our good friend Cord, who's going to give us a compliance update in the European Union.
Maybe you can lift the camera a bit up. Great, thanks a lot. So everyone can see my face. Thank you very much, Amanda. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to now welcome you to an update on EU healthcare compliance. So from the US via the Atlantic now to the European Union, and I'm happy to update you on the latest trends and developments when it comes to interactions with healthcare professionals on an EU level, but also to update you for some specific selected member states such as Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and also France. Please allow me to very briefly introduce myself and Field Fischer for the benefit of those who have not yet worked with us. My name is Cord Willüft. I'm a German qualified lawyer. I'm partner at the Field Fischer office in Munich, and I'm heading the German life science practice. And I'm advising, my team is advising pharmaceutical companies and medtech manufacturers in sector-specific legal areas, such as regulatory, healthcare compliance, and also market access, so pricing and reimbursement. And about Field Fischer. Field Fischer is a European-based law firm with 26 offices in 12 countries, with 1,700 lawyers in total. And one of our key practice areas is life science and healthcare. And apart from the 3 legal sector-specific areas where we support medtech companies and pharmaceutical companies, we also support our clients in technology and data. So I'm very happy to refer later to my colleague Oliver Sümer, partner from our Hamburg office, data privacy specialist, and with great expertise in life science or GDPR compliance for life science companies, but also in corporate, employment, and commercial and antitrust. So typically all the legal areas that are needed when a medtech company is doing business in the European Union. We have a dedicated European life science team with offices and specialists and expertise in all the key life science markets. You see the pictures and the contact information of the sector heads in Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and the UK. And we recently also opened an office in Vienna, so we can also support our clients, medtech companies doing business in the European Union on the Austrian market. So this about Field Fischer. Now I'm coming to the medtech healthcare compliance update on the European Union. Very brief view on the agenda. My slides are actually missing, I believe, or maybe the contact. Oh, here we go. There was the contact, my last slide put before the agenda. So a very brief view on the agenda. I will start with reminding you about the legal regime that applies to interactions with healthcare professionals on an EU level, because there is none. This is the starting point. This can be a very difficult situation for medtech companies globally acting. And then informing you about the latest trends when it comes to product-related advertisement, because we now face and experience some harmonization in that level. And there is a clear trend that we can see in the member states that direct-to-consumer advertisement, so medical device or country product-related advertisement to patients, laypersons, and the general public is more and more prohibited in the respective single member states. So this is the great trend that we are seeing here. And then I will conclude my presentation, my healthcare update, with a country-specific update concerning Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and France. So EU healthcare compliance, what is the legal framework? There is none. We don't have a harmonized approach among the member states when it comes to interactions with healthcare professionals. So there is no EU law for such interactions. So this, as I mentioned, can be a great challenge for medtech companies when they do business internationally, EU-wide, because they can actually face 27 country-specific setups. The same patchwork we are facing when it comes to the disclosure of transfer of value. We don't have an EU Sunshine Act. So this is also something that you have to take into consideration. Just to reassure you, this is different in the regulatory area for medical devices and for medicinal products. You all know that we now have the EU medical device regulation that is applicable since May 2021. We have a full harmonization for medicinal products since a few years, only via a directive, but nevertheless, the ECJ confirmed its full harmonization. And also for GDPR. There is a full harmonized approach among the member states, and you can be sure whenever you are doing business in 1, 2, or 3 countries, so European-wide, there will be the identical legal framework applicable. This does not apply for the interactions with healthcare professionals. Nevertheless, what you can do as a US legal department when you want to have a cross-border marketing or business project for the European Union, then you can be first reassured that the same principles for the interactions with healthcare professionals apply than in the US. That's the principle of transparency, of separation, equivalence, and documentation. The principle of equivalence, the background for this is fair market value. You all know this principle. Very interesting developments in the Netherlands. I will inform you about that a bit later. What else can you do then, having in mind that the same principle applies on the US market as well as on the EU market? You can certainly have a look at the Bible. So the METEC Europe Code of Ethical Business Practice, which just have been revised with effect of 1st January 2023. There you can see very helpful guidance with the typical engagements with healthcare professionals. And when you can already achieve a reasonable level of legal certainty when you follow that guidance. When you want to dig a bit deeper into the topics, there's also a compliance handbook issued by METEC Europe and updated on a 2-weekly basis. And there you will find maybe not an exhaustive list, but there you will find the country-specific requirements for interactions with healthcare professionals. So the approach is we don't have a harmonized standard among the member states, but you just have to take into consideration the applicable principles. You also find an ADVAMED in the ADVAMED code. Then you find it also in the METEC Europe Code of Ethical Business Practice, and then an additional review or research in the compliance handbook, and then you might be already on a sufficient basis for legal certainty when it comes to interactions with healthcare professionals. So this is the approach that you can usually do if you don't want to reach out to external legal counsel. So latest trends and developments when it comes to product-related advertisement in the European Union. I have said that we have no harmonized standard. Nevertheless, everyone was quite surprised when the MDR was first published. We could see that the European legislator took the approach to, at least to a certain extent, to harmonize product-related advertisement. You see in this Article 7 of the EU Medical Device Regulation, which is applicable since May 2021, you see 4 requirements when it comes to product-related advertisement. First, the general principles, very known, everyone knows it: misleading statements, misleading advertisement, misleading impressions are prohibited. This is nothing new. It's just new that it's expressly prohibited via the EU MDR. This principle already applies among the member states on basis of unfair competition law, but you have never found something like this in the regulatory law. What is new and might be also surprising for you is that whenever a manufacturer is doing product-related advertisement, they have to indicate the risk information or the safety issues that might occur when the medical device is used within its intended purpose. So we now also have the requirement of mandatory information for medical devices on the union market when it comes to product-related advertisement. Another prohibition that has been introduced in 2021 is the prohibition of off-label advertisement. Also nothing new for you, but new for the European Union. So this is very detailed, only to a little extent harmonized the regulatory or the legal background for product-related advertisement on an EU level. This still leaves a lot of room or a lot of discretion for member states to deal with it on a national basis differently. And what we are currently seeing is an increasing trend among the member states to prohibit direct-to-consumer advertisement. So whenever you do product-related advertisement for medical devices directly to laypersons, to patients, to the general public, this might be prohibited in some countries in the European Union. Lately, Poland has followed that approach and implemented the Polish Act on Medical Devices, which also prohibits direct-to-consumer advertisement since January 2023. This is quite challenging for internationally acting medical device companies, because you will, at least if you do not have an international accessible website, an international company website, then you will at least have one for the European Union. And how can you do it from a technical perspective to restrict the access for users, for patients from France and also from Poland and also from Spain, but not those who access your website from Germany or the UK. So here, just a very brief list of the countries where a direct-to-consumer advertisement is forbidden. And the crucial requirements are always, is this medical device intended to be used exclusively by healthcare professionals? This is one requirement when it comes on the list. Direct-to-consumer advertisement is prohibited. And the second is it reimbursed under the respective national health insurance scheme? So when you have this in mind, in Austria, Spain, Poland, France, and Italy, reimbursed exclusive use by healthcare professional, then it does fall under the prohibition of direct-to-consumer advertisement. What we see from our clients and what is maybe industry standard is then working with disclaimers. First of all, it's not a disclaimer, but first of all, use only educational language, balanced, reasonable, and educational language on your company website. Very difficult because national courts have the approach and the tendency to say, whenever you do a product-related statement on your company website, then they have the reflex to say this is promotion already. But nevertheless, if you try to keep your language very balanced and educational, you can always claim it's not promotion. So I can dispense this information also to consumers. The second is that you maybe work with a disclaimer where you clearly say, please only access this website if you are a healthcare professional. So this is the usual risk mitigation measures, what we are seeing from our clients in the European Union. So this is the latest trend of regarding product-related advertisement. I'm now coming to country update in Germany. Only a detail, but always of high interest for our clients. The meal limit has been increased since 2008. There was a meal limit of 60 euros applicable in Germany. Now it's 75. Last year, the pharmaceutical industry, FSR, has increased it from 60 to 75. The BVMed, the German, so the Federal MedTech Association in Germany, has now also adopted this approach in April 23. So you might want to update your internal company code of conduct for interactions with healthcare professionals. Germany is very much on the average when you compare it to other countries. You have Spain 80, Italy 60. France is a bit below, it's 70, but subject to a CNOM approval. And UK, the industry association, ABHI, is not yet providing a precise number. They only use the usual term reasonable, but the NHS has issued a guidance where they have said £75 is reasonable and within the limits that is allowed when it comes to business dinners or lunches with healthcare professionals. I already mentioned very exciting developments in the Netherlands. You might remember the principle of equivalence applies also to cooperation with healthcare professionals. So whenever you engage with a physician, you must make sure that the transfer of value, so the financial contribution or the payment for the medical service, represents fair market value. And the usual criteria, you're all aware of this, it's what is the qualification of the healthcare professional, what is the required expertise for this medical service, and how long does it take to fulfill this service. These are the general criteria to assess what is fair market value for the respective engagement. Very difficult gray area, so subject to a lot of case law, but the local industry association in the Netherlands, GMH, has a very great approach to achieve legal certainty. They have published an indexation of maximum hourly rate for HCP services. And I think that's really great. This is a unique approach for the entire European Union. And you can see exactly in which qualification, in which criteria does for your HCP that you are engaging with, and then you have a clear benchmark on how much you might pay on an hourly rate. Very interesting from a legal perspective. Maybe it's just an industry guideline for the Netherlands, but nevertheless, if a German-based manufacturer is challenged because it's paying too much to a healthcare professional, we can always say, but we are below the 267 that is paid for a professor. And in the Netherlands and in Germany, you have more or less the same economic standard, the same economic purchase power. And so it might be possible to maybe that this indexation, only applicable in the Netherlands, might also have an indirect effect in Germany. I'm very interested on the approach that will be taken on that in the next months and years. Country update Italy. I also mentioned when it comes to the disclosure of transfer of value in the European Union, we don't have an EU law, we don't have an EU Sunshine Act. We only have in some member states national Sunshine Acts. And the latest that has been implemented was in Italy. It was already implemented in May 2022, but the technical requirements were not established yet. So the Italian Transparency Register was not created, not established. And it's now that the necessary decree and draft technical specifications have been published in August 2023, and they are expected to enter into force end of 2023. So the reporting obligations for Italy, whenever there is a transfer of value to an Italian physician, might apply then from 2024 on. Have this in mind. You see the benchmarks that are reportable. You also see that there are only some countries who have a national Sunshine Act. This is Belgium, France, now Italy, not entered into force entirely, but also Italy, the Netherlands, and Portugal. We don't have a national Sunshine Act in the UK for the time being, and also in Germany. I would not expect ever a Sunshine Act in Germany, but we don't have, therefore we don't have one yet, and maybe not in 5 or 10 years. And in those countries like Germany and UK, the transparency requirements, the disclosure requirements are taken from the METEC Europe Code of Ethical Business Practice, and only transfer of value in context of educational grants are required to be disclosed. So quite comfortable, and I think a very practical approach in these two countries. Country update France. You might have heard about the discussions on the French Medical Charter for the promotion of medical devices. It was the intention of the French legislator to achieve quality controls when it comes to promotion of medical devices to physicians. And therefore, this French Medical Charter for the promotion of medical devices have been implemented last year. And it's again that the French legislator is very creative when it comes to compliance laws. They have found regulations like they have limited the number of visits that a sales representative from a medical device company is allowed to do on an annual basis. Only 4 sales promotional visits are allowed in context between medical device companies, sales rep, and physicians. This is something that can impose a very high burden on medical device manufacturers active on the French market, because how will you monitor what your sales representative is doing? This is something like a black box. We at least get this feedback from most of our clients. And then how will you register it? The second thing is, what is a promotional visit? Medical device manufacturers are required to train their users. So when you send a sales representative to a physician, is this a kind of training, a very balanced, reasonable, non-promotional training, or is it a promotional visit? So a lot of discussions about this French Medical Charter, but for the time being, I'm at least happy to say that it's not effective yet, although it has been published in March 2022, but it is expected to enter into force only in spring 2025. So still some time to prepare for that and to also hear if these questions can be answered. So my last slide, healthcare compliance, again, country update in France. Influencer marketing is an increasing trend since 5 to 10 years. It's a very new law that has been published in France, which is saying that whenever an influencer is doing promotional statements on behalf of a medical device manufacturer, then this needs to be clearly marked as advertisement or commercial collaboration. This is something that already applies in Spain, Italy, and now in France. We don't have such a law in Germany, but nevertheless, it was always the approach of national courts saying when there is an influencer doing promotion for a medical device, he or she has to also clearly indicate it's advertisement, it's commercial, it's an ad, because otherwise it would be misleading in the subcategory of hidden advertisement. But just to inform you, this is now expressly also required in France. Very interesting will be, you might recall that I have said Article 7 of the EU MDR now requires mandatory information within product-related advertisement for medical devices. So you have to inform the user about potential risk when the medical device is used within its intended purpose. So how can you know the character of influencer marketing, it's very short, it's very brief, it's sharp. So how can you have kind of text block like this, safety information when an influencer is just thumbing up? So this is the latest trends and developments on an EU level and in some selected member states. And I hope that was very informative for you. And I'm now happy to take any questions that you might have. All question answered?
There's one that came online. It's a really good question. I don't know if you guys work with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act at all, but essentially they're asking, because the EU doesn't have a uniform standard on interactions with HCPs, how does that intersect with like Foreign Corrupt Practices Act actions? I don't know if anybody from Gardner has thoughts on that.
I mean, there is EUCAMED, so that would be, I mean, there is a code like AdvaMed in Europe.
Yeah, MedTech code.
MedTech code, thank you,
Used to be
rightfully named. And Cord, you can comment on that. I think from an FCPA standpoint, though, I mean, if you're bribing foreign dignitaries, employees, physicians in Europe are generally employees of the government. So if you bribe them to curry favor, get them to do something for you, you're gonna be violating US law. So it's sort of, you could be violating European law, I suppose, as well. Maybe, I know, Cord, there's kickback laws in UK and Germany and other jurisdictions, right? Maybe you want to comment a little more on that.
Yeah, there is indeed the UK Bribery Act, and since 2016 we also have the law against corruption in the healthcare sector. So it's a criminal law which had a huge effect on the market because the compliance acceptance was now much higher. It was now possible to get imprisoned because of if you bribe somebody, if you practice corruption to increase your sales. But formerly it was only unfair competition law that was applicable. So you would have been challenged in front of a civil law. You might have been subject to any compensations or liabilities on a financial basis. So indeed, the UK Bribery Act and also the German Act against corruption in the healthcare sector had a huge effect on the markets. But still, we only have on an EU level industry guidelines, and these to impose criminal sanctions when it comes to undue influence of healthcare professionals is still in the competency of the member states.
And Cord, thanks for commenting too about this issue around social media and whatnot. I know having been out at Fidley last week, they talked about how there was I think it was a Swedish citizen that, and maybe I don't know if you read about this, he commented online on a blog about a dietary supplement and made claims that maybe it could treat, cure, prevent, mitigate disease, which caused it to be a drug. This person had no financial interest in the product. It was just a lone blogger, and I think the Danish authorities convicted him. They gave him a 9-month suspended sentence and a big fine. And I was very puzzled by this because it's cross jurisdictions and whatnot. But I kind of walked away from that, just realizing and appreciating from all the comments from European colleagues at FIDLI that things have changed very much from a DTCA standpoint in Europe. And it sounds like that you're seeing that in your practice as well.
Yes, indeed. So the ECJ has already, maybe now 10, 12 or 13 years ago, the European Court of Justice confirmed that even if a third party, like a patient, without any commercial interest, is doing a positive statement about a medical device in whatever kind of environment, he or she would be liable for that. So that's a very interesting approach indeed.
And we'll hand it over to Paul here, but I just think like for the American audience that's online and here in the room, I mean, the First Amendment, it doesn't exist in a lot of jurisdictions right outside of the United States. What you can say publicly is very different and what you can do. And so I think that's a good message to marketers to be very careful because of, again, they might post something on social media that they think is innocuous and maybe they're just naive to the rules. They could wind up literally potentially, with a criminal charge and conviction. So I think they need to be very careful.
So thank you very much for your attention and your interesting questions. And I'm now handing over to Paul.
I may need that. Thanks, Cord. So medtech meets high tech, privacy, cybersecurity, AI. These are some topics that are exciting to me and hopefully interesting enough to you to keep your attention for about 20 minutes here. So we're going to go pretty rapid fire through this, just given the time and the topic. But I do want to just give a quick background. I've practiced in privacy and cybersecurity for the last 10 years and focused on things like HIPAA, state privacy laws, GDPR, other healthcare compliance matters at the firm. So I've got a lot of experience in connected devices and a lot of the privacy issues associated with that. So we'll talk through what I've seen, some of the things to consider in developing and marketing those products. So we'll do a quick background, go through really briefly some law and regulation. Not a lot of time on that because I think the implications are as interesting as the law, or a lot more interesting than the law. And then we'll talk about just a few deep dives into types of devices and some of the business models and how those variables can really impact strategy and how do we approach privacy and cybersecurity with intentionality, with proactivity to address those issues before we're at the point where contracts are being signed and we're not quite sure why we're signing this contract versus that, or what the provisions that benefit our company are. So we'll get into that in a second. So where are we now? Cybersecurity is enormously significant and important when it comes to connected devices. You can see just from these headlines, which I grabbed from some recent articles, and clearly people are concerned and interested, whether it's patients, customers at hospitals, manufacturers, the government, everyone is interested and concerned about device security, especially when it comes to patients. If a patient's impacted negatively by a device, or if privacy isn't protected with the new kind of trend of wearables, Internet of Things, the kinds of devices that are in your home or on your person throughout the day and tracking you and collecting information. There needs to be a level of trust in those devices and the privacy that they provide and the protection from misuse or other things that can happen with cybersecurity breaches. So there's significant concern about that, and it has a big impact on adoption as well of these devices. There's a lot of different types of devices, as you no doubt know. There's plenty of in-home wearables, products that patients keep on their person or around them. There's privacy implications with that we'll talk about. There's durable medical equipment, and there's also even in clinic kinds of devices that can have significant privacy implications, and different angles or issues that can come up as these products are deployed. And then of course software itself on its own can be a medical device, as we know, and that has its own privacy implication and its own concerns, and many times software is mixed with a physical product, so we have kind of cross implications, if you will, between those things. And there's other new innovative types of devices that we're seeing every day. So some of the variables that I think are worth talking about are business model. So you might on the one hand have a product that's sold to a customer like a hospital or an ASC or some sort of location that provides medical services to individuals, and you're going to have very different contractual relationships and privacy concerns than if you're involved in, say, the DME relationship, where the patient is generally the one signing those agreements with you. So there's differences in that, and whether it's software and you have sort of ongoing privacy obligations and business associate agreements and other things that might come with software that's hosted by the company, by the manufacturer, versus maybe it's software that's sold to and purchased by and then implemented locally by a customer. Beyond that, there's device types that can impact data collection, right? So if you have a DME device that's held by the patient, maybe it's an insulin pump or some sort of smart device that's worn on the wrist or on some part of the body, those kinds of devices are directly collecting data from the patient, and the company, typically then the manufacturer, is directly involved in handling and managing that data as, in some ways, a healthcare provider. On the other hand, you might have devices that collect data really indirectly, and you have to negotiate those things with a customer. Clinical trials versus commercials, data collection can vary as well, right? If you have informed consent, that might broaden and increase the ability to use data, whereas if you go through more of a commercial model, even your interaction with the patient, through a customer might be challenging and getting data appropriately. So we'll talk about a lot of these things in more detail, but I'll also get into data use, data ownership, and how that's affected by all of these models and variables that can come into play. So a quick summary of law. We'll get through this quickly, but we all know about the HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, focused on covered entities. So we'll briefly talk about that. The Federal Trade Commission Act and how that impacts privacy, and really for manufacturers is maybe one of the most broadly applicable laws because it addresses consumer privacy from a consumer protection standpoint, and really in a sense captures everything that some of these other sector specific or state specific laws do not. We'll talk about state law briefly. That's such a big topic right now, and the trend is extreme in terms of new laws developing, and the implications for manufacturers in this space are incredible. So we'll talk about that briefly. And then the Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act, of course, has implications for safety and effectiveness of devices, and cybersecurity is really a critical part of safety and effectiveness when we're talking about smart connected devices. So HIPAA, just briefly to kind of highlight why this is really relevant. For the most part, connected devices have a lot of data collection and data processing that happens within the company that provides the device. That's very common. We'll see devices that are at home and the person's on maybe they're a wearable like a monitor, a remote monitoring tool, or a vest or something that collects data. Or we might have in-clinic devices that process data, but maybe even within that there's a cloud connectivity of that device so that the manufacturer is actually processing that data through AWS or through Azure or some other tool, some third-party hosted cloud system that's managed really through the manufacturer. There's so many different ways that data can be collected and processed that HIPAA would address. So that gets into, is the company a covered entity? Durable medical equipment manufacturers often are covered entities in most cases. We also have the potential for business associate agreements, and that's extremely common in the connected device space, because once the company starts processing data outside of that kind of in-clinic, in-network customer side, there's going to be an inquiry from that customer saying, you really need to consider signing this business associate agreement with us, or we won't buy your product. So that's important as well. The FTCA, again, just to briefly highlight this, but consumer protection is the key phrase there. And that's all the way from privacy concerns and cybersecurity concerns in terms of fairness, potential deception if you make claims as an organization that we will protect data with HIPAA compliant standards, for example. The FTC is interested in whether you as an organization and a manufacturer are following those promises and making good on those commitments. Along with that, although there's plenty of case law on the privacy and cybersecurity side from the FTC's enforcement actions, AI is beginning to be a key point or a focal point of FTC interest, and they've expressed that through their blogging recently. So if you go to the FTC blog, you can see some explanations or some highlights of things that they might be looking for from an AI perspective. We don't have a lot of case law there yet, but we do have some kind of hints towards we'll be looking at misuse of data. So we've got some case law around that because privacy is implicated when an AI algorithm is developed from personal data. What if that's not consented to properly, or what if there isn't care given to how that data is collected? That can implicate any kind of algorithm if that's involved. Copyright, IP, is data that's being used owned by another party. We could think about generative AI and what are the implications of that if a company uses another company's data to or another person's or organization's data to create an algorithm. So there's quite a few issues that we can dig into there. State privacy laws, I'll just highlight this, but there are over a dozen privacy laws that we've seen come on the books in the past 2 years. And most of them are pretty broad and cover a lot of different ground. For the most part, though, they're targeted at, okay, we have large amounts of data collection online, and how is that managed? So you might see things like threshold numbers of individual data records, from within that specific state. But kind of a recent trend this year, since the Washington My Health, My Data Act and a few other kind of copycat laws, we are seeing a trend towards regulating consumer health data. So that's, again, on top of these broader state privacy laws, we're seeing a direct regulation of health information that has fallen outside of kind of direct regulation to this point. For example, HIPAA, so because these laws are targeting that information, they're also restricting things like geofencing of healthcare facilities where services are provided. So trying to protect patient privacy from not only, the broad perspective, but also targeting specific activities that manufacturers or other companies are involved in that can implicate privacy issues. And you can see a list of some of those types of requirements that we're seeing come with those laws. And as you know, FDA is very interested in cybersecurity. Recent guidance finalized just in the past couple of months, so you can take a close look at that as well. So what are some considerations when we're digging into, let's say we're developing a new product that's connected, a smart device? We got to think about cybersecurity. I think that's fundamental. Obviously, safety and effectiveness is key, but also in these connected devices, there's an infrastructure around it. It's not just a device and the security associated with that device. What about the cloud provider that, perhaps an AI system is relying upon to do the diagnostics or monitoring or whatever it is? We need to have awareness of the full infrastructure around that device and do risk assessments, do planning around cyber incidents, what kind of resiliency is in place to make sure that this product continues to work as intended and it protects the privacy of the patients. From a data flow perspective, again, it's everything involved in that particular device. So perhaps, you have a programmer that's in clinic, but it uploads data to the cloud. Who is involved in managing that cloud system? Is it a third party? Are there agreements in place to secure the data throughout the life cycle? Understanding all of the data flow implications of that smart device are critical. Understanding the data collection. So devices are going to collect more data as they're implemented. It might have a smart watch, for example, that collects blood pressure information and heart rate and these other things, sleep, add to the list. You can imagine that certain folks who are really interested in the exciting parts of the technology in your organization are also going to want to collect more data and do more things, whether it's in a clinical context or within a commercial context. So really understanding the data collection and keeping updated on that is key. What will you do with the data once it's collected? So anticipate that. What is the business looking to do? Plan for that carefully. What about patient rights? So do we need consent in order to use data appropriately? Many of these state laws are requiring patient consent explicitly in order to use patient information. And then also, what about contracts and how will that affect ability to use and who owns data? Right now, if you bring a business associate agreement to a healthcare provider that you're selling a product to and say, insert a clause, we are going to own the data, all of it's, our intellectual property, that's probably not going to fly with most healthcare customers in the US right now. But there are probably ways that you can work around that and strategy you can take to address that. So plan for those kinds of issues early on in the process. So just a few things to think about. So let's say you have, we'll go into a couple deep dives on a couple product types. So for example, durable medical equipment, HIPAA covered entities in most cases. So we have immediately to think about all of the privacy implications of that. There are many rules that apply. You have required policies and procedures, security rule, all of those things directly applicable. And of course, with that, you're directly interacting with patients. So what about the consents you might need to address, data use, data sharing that's necessary to operate the product? How about the prescriber? What's their involvement? What about data sharing with the prescriber then? So we have to make sure that that's covered with consent, with other engagements with that patient. Who owns the data? Is that something that, are you offering a tool that the prescriber uses? Is it an EHR integration? Different things of that nature can lead to questions about who owns the data that results from this. So a lot of different questions can arise. Remote patient monitoring. This is a little bit different from DME in that usually there's a customer that's a healthcare provider purchasing this product and then deploying it with their patients. So who is the data shared with? Is there a consent mechanism to make sure that, say, a parent or a caregiver in the patient's life is accessing some of that information perhaps? What about with the HCP or other involved providers? What about the management of consent? So if the patient does say, I would like this caregiver to be involved in my care, and then perhaps later changes their mind, is there a way to manage those kind of withdrawals of consent or granting of consent in a way that makes sense, right? That can be challenging to manage that. So think about that as you're developing the solution. You can see a whole list of other things, and for the sake of time, we'll kind of just leave that on the screen for you to look at, but there's a lot of considerations in these kinds of products. Implants, think about how does your product go through when you're going to a customer, some of their diligence, right? So in implants in particular, I think about what about the programmer that's typically at the provider? How are you going to explain the security of the device to that provider in a way that convinces them that if I put this in my network at the hospital or at the ASC or wherever it is, that it's actually secure, it won't compromise the systems that I'm dependent on to operate my business. And there are questions more and more about that from customers. Will you have business associate agreements requested? And how will you address that? Will you say, no, we're not a business associate? Are you going to have to sign those agreements, and how will you navigate that? Kind of thinking about that up front is critical. Really similar issues to kind of the programmer scenario, but again, the security of the device in clinic is going to drive a lot of your discussions with potential customers. Is how can we possibly make sure that this is secure, and then answering, in some cases, 100 questions about the security of the device in that context. And I'm sure as we develop more, we'll see questions about AI and how that operates within these devices to really try to explain, okay, to a customer, this is how we plan for resiliency and all the other things that come along with reliance on a connected device. Clinical trials, I won't dig too deep into this, but just considering, okay, if we have a connected device, is the company a business associate, even as it signs, clinical trial agreements? Will they also at the hospital or the institution ask us to sign a business associate agreement, because the company is operating not only as a sponsor and collecting that data through the electronic data capture or some other tool like that, we're also processing clinical data. Is that possible in some of these scenarios as well? Of course, FDA always has a critical eye to safety and effectiveness, so we can't forget about that in all of these device categories. So some quick takeaways here. Again, understand the data flow, so be aware of how the device and the infrastructure around it can manage your, to manage cybersecurity, to manage privacy. Those things are important. And then plan contracts and kind of around the business goals of the company. So there have to be some discussions about what are the intended data use implications here. Do we want to do AI, machine learning with this data? Is it something we can do? What are the legal feasible options? Sometimes because of the kind of variables in the device model and business model, we won't be able to use data the way we want to. So how do we flexibly approach that? Are there some changes we can make early on before it's too late to make those changes? Of course, patient consent, what kind of approach will you take? Who's responsible for that? Planning for that. And then look at all of the ecosystem cybersecurity wise and be prepared to deal with privacy and cybersecurity kind of safety and effectiveness issues. Then be flexible. This is a rapidly changing area of law, so there is a lot to consider, and you might be halfway across the stream in terms of development and realize there's some new legal issues to deal with, new state laws, and potentially new federal law in the future. So we'll always be flexible. So that concludes a quick recap on privacy around all of these things. And I'll close with a quick transition here. So I'll invite Oliver to come join me as we briefly talk about AI developments and then transition to his presentation. So just a couple thoughts on AI from a US perspective. We really aren't seeing heavy regulation from an AI perspective in the US right now. It's really been driven more so by these kind of ancillary issues, IP, the ownership of data, generative AI, and how that's going to impact is there copyright issues when you produce something that uses AI that's based on broad data sets that aren't owned by the company that necessarily creates that algorithm or uses the algorithm. And then privacy issues, which are, is the data that's used to create the algorithm appropriately consented? Is it de-identified? Those kinds of questions too. So that's really what we're seeing. There is an executive order on AI that was issued just a little over a week ago, but we don't really know the implications of that fully. It's an executive order, and it mostly is going to impact how the federal government uses AI, but we'll kind of keep an eye on that as well.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, and let me give you a quick update on the situation on AI regulation in the European Union. We have an Artificial Intelligence Act that is in the final phase of the legislative process currently. There are some very controversial discussions between the EU member states and the commissions and the parliament about if and to what extent also generative AI applications like ChatGPT should be regulated. There is a proposal from the Parliament version that is extremely strict with regard to obligations for generative AI operators and providers. And that is the thing that is currently under the final discussion. If everything goes as things are planned, this Artificial Intelligence Act would enter into force in the beginning of next year. It has to actually, because there are elections in Europe next summer. So the current Commission needs to finalize their legislative approaches that they started during this period. But currently it's very unsure if they will be able to stick to that timeline. The general message that I can give you in that regard is that it's a very strict approach, not only in terms of generative AI, but also in terms of AI software parts that are used for medical devices, for example. And it's a risk-based approach, saying basically the higher the risk of a certain AI application, for example, in the health sector, the more obligations you have to consider. It's about transparency obligations, documentation, a similar approach like you might have heard it from the GDPR. So a lot of accountability, documentation, transparency obligations before you can enter into the market and provide these applications in the future.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to give you a little bit of an update with regard to cybersecurity laws in the European Union. We skipped the questions, Paul, but we can do that after my presentation, actually. So usually when we have these seminars, I'm speaking about data protection, privacy, and the GDPR. There is always interesting updates about activities of the European data protection authorities, investigations, the number of fines, the sectors they have in focus. But I will take a different approach today because there is new legislation at the horizon in Europe, especially with regard to cybersecurity. We are facing a new directive, and as this directive will impose very complex obligations, not only, but in particular also to medical device companies, I will focus on this piece of legislation today. I am a partner with Field Fisher. Cord already introduced me briefly. I'm doing tech and data law for more than 25 years now, and I started to focus on the life science sector when the GDPR entered into force a couple of years ago, because that was the time when also many US clients from Field Fisher had to make sure they are compliant with this new privacy obligations. It was interesting to see some numbers that Amanda, you provided earlier in your presentation about the development of the digital health market and connected devices in the health sector. And I will also present you some numbers with regard to the European Union, and then in the next step, introduce you to the so-called NIS2 directive, what that means, what the abbreviation is, and what impact it has for the health industry will be part of my presentation today. So the European digital health market is extremely growing, similar development as we heard it about the US from Amanda this morning. And there are a number of studies, some of them officially carried out by the European Commission. And one of them says that the market will be reaching 55.4 billion euro by 2027. And in parallel to that, of course, also the number of health devices in Europe increased extremely in the last years, from 500 million in 2018 to 620 million in 2019. And until 2024, it's expected to reach 1.4 billion medical devices in Europe alone. You can see the key categories here that the study has taken into account, but I think the most important message here, of course, is the more connected devices we have in the market, the more potential exposure to cybersecurity risks. There's a clear relation to that. I don't know about your experience, but I can tell you from this year alone, we have noticed a significant increase of cybersecurity attacks of many of our clients, in particular, but not limited to the healthcare market and the life science sector. In particular, at the beginning of this year, there has been a huge number of attacks in terms of ransomware attacks against life science companies. And that is a phenomenon that well, is not new, but the numbers are increasing. And that is reason enough for the European Union, the European Commission, well, to counteract against these developments. We see an increasingly exposed privacy security risks in Europe. And I already mentioned cybersecurity and ransomware attacks, but also general data breaches that are subject then to the General Data Protection Regulation as soon as personal data are affected are important. We see cases of cyber espionage in increasing numbers. And according to statistics from the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, the so-called ENISA, the number of reported cybersecurity incidents in the health sector increased by 47% between 2018 and 2019, and that was only 2019. There are no actual numbers about the development between 2019 and 2023. But, well, I think we are all aware of that these risks are extremely increasing currently. There are also some important and interesting numbers, I would say, about what are the most common types of incidents. And what I found in particular interesting was the average duration of incidents. That was 36 hours. And the average impact for data subjects was about 14,000 affected users in average. And that's quite a high number. And as there are always personal data affected in these cases, that has also a huge impact to your obligations under the General Data Protection Regulation. You will be aware of the fact that these breaches will have to be reported to the competent authorities within a very short deadline. And yeah, that's all a very interesting, but also, well, negative development that we see in these numbers. So now to the NIS2 directive. You could say that is the answer of the European Commission to all these risks that I presented. This directive is part of the EU cybersecurity strategy that has been adopted already in 2020. And you could say that this piece of legislation is actually, well, the core part of this strategy. It will replace the previous Network and Information Security Directive from 2016. That's why it's the NIS Directive, Network and Information Security Directive. And it aims to establish a high common level of cybersecurity across the European Union. And it expands the scope of the sectors covered by the cybersecurity obligations, including a broader range of entities in the healthcare sector and in particular manufacturers of certain medical devices. And let me already anticipate that it will assign liability and responsibility directly to the management. I think that is one of the key questions. And there will be personal liability of the managing directors of companies who are providing these kind of medical devices. And that is quite a new and very strict approach that has been taken here by the European Commission. A brief overview, I already said that the NIS2 directive will replace and build on the previous NIS directive, which was from 2016. And it's also important, and that provides for the complexity of this legislation, that it is again a directive. It's not a regulation. You know from the GDPR, which is a regulation, and also from the upcoming Artificial Intelligence Act, that a regulation is something that is directly applicable in all European member states. That's the best approach the European Commission can take when they want to reach a fully harmonized legal framework. Here, they take a different approach. They had to take the different approach, which is the directive. And that means that this directive needs to be implemented into any individual member states. So currently, as the directive entered into force in January this year, the member states are working on the implementation, and there's not much time left until 17th of October 2024. All member states will have to implement this directive into their national laws. I know from Germany, Austria, and a number of member states that they are intensively working on that. And as always, that has the risk of, well, a fragmented legal framework, because the directive very clearly says that the member states can go beyond these already very strict obligations. So for multinational life science companies that are operating in different European markets, it's very challenging. The more markets you have where you're active, the more challenging these very complex obligations that are imposed by this directive. To give you a very brief overview, why is this important for the life science sector? The concept of the directive is that it operates with two annexes, and in these two annexes there are definitions about all the markets and kind of companies that are subject to this directive. Please note that in the printouts that you have, there is a very important part missing, unfortunately, so you should take your key now and add that. You see here the excerpt from Annex 2. You have in your printout the first part, which says that, for example, healthcare providers are subject to this directive, but also medical device manufacturers that are considered to be critical during a public health emergency, for example, that are more the exemptions. But the more important part, actually, at least from a medical device manufacturer standpoint, is that manufacturer of medical devices are explicitly mentioned in the annex. So that means in a result that more or less every kind of medical device, as soon as it is a connected device, will be subject to this directive. That's really the important thing here. But also, if you see that healthcare providers are subject and in the scope of this directive, that will have probably very interesting consequences as well, because one of the obligations that I will refer to later is the obligation of supply chain due diligence. You need to make sure in the future that in your supply chain, also other companies that are delivering products or technology for your medical device are following these cybersecurity obligations, and that they have carried out the same IT security measures that you have to demonstrate when you provide these devices to the market. From a healthcare professional, let's take a hospital, for example, it will be the other way around. They will have to go into their supply chain, so probably will have to check if their providers of connected devices have been compliant with these new obligations. So even if you would not care for your company and your products yourself, sooner or later the market will ask you to do so, and that's I think a very important consequence of this directive. So that means the new directive covers a wider range of healthcare entities compared to the former NIS directive. It's including manufacturers of medical devices, I already said that, but also explicitly in vitro diagnostic medical devices considered to be critical during a potential public health emergency, wearable devices, telehealth solution, but also in silico medicine to a large extent, software as a medical device, digital twins, among others. So everything in a broader sense that can be connected, that is smart, that is collecting, processing, and transferring data will be probably subject to this directive. And also important to understand that these directive defines two different categories for entities that fall within the scope of the directive. There is a distinction between so-called essential and important companies. The criteria for that is the revenue of a company and the number of employees. So the obligations that you have either as an essential or as an important company according to that directive are more or less the same. The difference is how you can be subject to investigations and subject to orders from the competent authorities. Because you will see that later in my slides. If you are an essential company, the authorities have much more rights to investigate into your company than if you would be only a so-called important company. This one is very important as well. I already mentioned it briefly. The entities are deemed to be under the jurisdictions of the member states where they provide their services, basically. If you have an establishment in one of the member states, then it's easier. Then you will be subject to the laws, let's say in Italy, in Germany, or wherever your establishment is. But if you do not have an establishment in the EU and you provide your services, your medical connected devices in a number of member states, then you will probably have to deal with all these different laws that are now in the phase of implementation by the European member states. And that really provides a jurisdictional complexity that can be really challenging. You know that from a couple of other European legal areas probably, but this one, well, will be again something that provides for some complexity in that regard. There are a number of examples which are not so important for your sector, for your market. But again, as it is a directive, it will be quite difficult to handle it in different European jurisdictions. So the top 5 key, not E, changes under the NIS2 directive are the ones that I have listed here. And I will try to very briefly present these 5 to you. There are a couple of more, but these I would say are the most important ones. And what I can tell already now, my advice really would be start to well, work on that as soon as possible. October 2024 is not too long away. It's less than a year. And everyone who was already working with the implementation of GDPR and GDPR compliance knows how complex these challenges can be. So 11 months is really a very short period. And even if the member states do not have finally implemented these directives into the national laws, the directive itself at least provides the framework, the general framework, and that should already be enough in order to at least a little bit start to do some preparatory work in order to be compliant when everything will enter into force. So the first thing and the most important obligation is that the directive expands the cybersecurity risk management measures. All organizations must take appropriate and proportionate technical, but not only technical, but also organizational measures, not only to manage risks to the NIS used for operations or provisions of services, but also prevent or minimize the impact of incidents, if you should face an incident someday, on the recipients of the services. And that's the key message here. So that requires a cybersecurity risk assessment, actually, and an assessment that, well, puts you in the position to know if there are gaps from a technical perspective, if there are gaps policy-wise. Do you have an incident response plan? What kind of policies in case of a data security incident do you have in the company? All that is subject of these cybersecurity management measures. The key criteria that provides for some flexibility, of course, is appropriate and proportionate. So it very much depends on the certain degree of risk exposure of a product, of a company, to what extent you need to update maybe your cybersecurity technologies. It depends on an entity size, and of course also the likelihood of an occurrence. But with regard to the life science sector, my experience in the last like 11 months is that, well, it's one of the sectors that is extremely exposed to cybersecurity, and that's why you probably need to take this very serious. And then that's what I already briefly referred to. There are direct management responsibilities under this new directive. So the management bodies must explicitly approve and oversee the implementation of the risk management measures. It's a direct obligation of the top management of a company. And you are also responsible for undertaking cybersecurity training, not only for the management itself, but also for the staff to the extent they are dealing with technology and security topics. And there are sanctions. I already mentioned that, a personal liability for the management. So that's why this should really be taken serious. I already briefly referred to the supply chain security diligence, also something that you could already start working on. Assess your supply chains with regard to your medical connected devices as long as they fall under the scope of this directive, because that will probably also lead to contract adjustments. You might need to refer to these new obligations in the contracts with your suppliers. And we all know how complex these contract structures and supply chains can be, depending on the number of devices that you have in the market and the number of different suppliers that you're working with in order to provide these technologies. So that is something, again, where I would advise to start early, at least with the initial internal analysis about where do we have supply chains, what are our partners, our suppliers for our connected devices that will probably fall under this directive. And then also important, the future incident reporting obligations. You might recall that from the GDPR, you are obliged to report to the competent authorities within 72 hours. These incident reporting obligations are general. It's not only an obligation if personal information is affected, but every potential incident, as soon as it has a certain significance, needs to be reported. There's a three-step approach. You need to report an early warning within 24 hours, then a more sophisticated incident notification within 72 hours, and then you need to provide a final report once everything has been assessed and forensic investigations are completed. But that's also something that needs to be planned in terms of internal processes, who's responsible for what, how can you put your company, your team in a position to be able to comply with these very strict deadlines and obligations. Then finally, the supervision and sanctions, as always, an important part. You see in the last line here, the difference between essential entities and important entities. So important entities can be fined with 7 million or 1.4% of the annual turnover per year. With regard to essential entities, it's even 2%, similar approach as we know it from the GDPR, or 10 million, whatever is higher. And you also see in this overview the different administrative sanctions and orders that are possible for the authorities. So it's very important to assess if you fall under the category of essential or only an important entity. That's also something that I would recommend to assess so that you are aware of which category do you fall in. Well, that's it, more or less. I have summed up the key steps that I would recommend to do in this last slide. I think the last one, maybe the most important one is the last one, train. Get involved and inform yourself about the obligations that these NIS2 directive is imposing on the industry. There are really complex challenges coming up. And yeah, my advice would be start early to deal with it if you have operations in Europe. There will be a lot of new obligations in the near future. Thanks for listening to this, and I'm open, of course, for any questions here from the audience or remotely. Happy to take them. Please.
Hi, I actually have a question, maybe more to the last.
Here, let me get you the microphone.
Hi, thank you. So this may be more actually specific to what Paul, you were discussing, because it's a bit of a US-based question. But I was wondering, when you talked about HIPAA and you talked about FTC and then also privacy state laws, do you mind talking briefly about preemption? So when would state privacy laws perhaps not apply? Do they always apply?
Yeah, great question. Maybe I'll come up front just for a second here, so that the online audience can see me. Yeah, when it comes to state laws, HIPAA in particular, HIPAA does override certain state laws. However, there has to be a conflict between HIPAA and that state law. For the most part, that doesn't happen, and HIPAA does allow for state law to be more protective of patient privacy. So you could have, for example, in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Health Records Act, and that requires patient consent for various things that HIPAA would allow without consent. When it comes to these other state privacy laws, what they're trying to do is actually cover ground that HIPAA does not cover. So they don't conflict, and they actually just create new privacy requirements that wouldn't otherwise be there if HIPAA alone were to apply. So that's really what we're seeing.
Thank you.
Another question for you, Paul. I'll just bring it up here for you.
Okay. Okay, here's the question. Can you speak to a manufacturer's options when deciding whether it's a covered entity or a hybrid entity contractually with its customers? For example, is there a data ownership advantage if a manufacturer considers itself a covered entity when negotiating contracts with, for example, hospital customers? Yeah, good question. The challenge I think here is really your organization is or is not a covered entity based on what it does. So it's definitionally about the factual, what circumstances is your company in. Typically covered entities are only those that bill insurance directly. So we don't see that too often except in the DME space or maybe laboratories. Most of the time that's not going to happen unless you have a DME.
No, that was the only one I saw. Oh, here. Oh, pause just a second.
Do you have any suggested resources for remote monitoring, like further conferences or books or things to read about how companies need to manage that area?
Yeah, is that for either of us?
Either. Yeah, I mean, because obviously we'll be in both markets. So.
Yeah, as far as resources, obviously you can always dig into, at least from a privacy standpoint, there's a lot of FAQs and so on the HIPAA website through the HHS. You can look into that. Specifically though, I can't think of any resources offhand that I'd recommend, but I'd be happy to share some offline if you'd like.
For Europe, the European trade associations are quite a good point of contact and information. I'm happy to share some links with you. Yeah.
And I'll just add quickly on the patient monitoring aspect. FDA has a lot of guidance and regulations around that. And there's a difference between active patient monitoring and so that's very important from an FDA perspective. So I'd encourage you to, I think there's actually a guidance document, which maybe Nate will talk about.
Yeah, I would expect a lot of guidance to come from the FDA and FTC continuing. Like Amanda said, there's a ton out there, but more to come. We'll stop there. Why don't we start again at 5 after the hour, just so we have long enough time to have a break. So that's 11:05 local time. And I just want to, let's give a round of applause to all the great speakers this morning.
So it looks like everyone in the room is getting settled. I'd like to welcome everybody back. Really appreciate the presenters so far. There's been a lot of great information shared, information that we can all implement into our practice. My name is Nathan Downing. I focus mostly on FDA matters, regulatory compliance, and today I want to really discuss how to approach FDA and how to think about your FDA communication strategy as it relates to AI. And I'm going to kick off with a story, and it kind of will frame the context and how I think about approaching FDA and using them as partnership. This morning, my wife and my dog were on a run in our hometown. My wife and dog like to run every morning, and this morning, as they were running by a house, a grill exploded. It's probably like 5:30 or 6 in the morning. My wife goes pretty early. And after the grill exploded, a fire started. It went to the deck. And then it started going towards the house, and a portion of the house, very small, caught on fire. And by that point, my wife had called 911 and the fire department showed up and some other neighbors had helped get people out. And so the house was saved. And you say, how does this relate to FDA, right? You're all going to experience fires in your day-to-day experience, right? And so you're going to have to determine, is this a fire that I can put out? Did I fail a test? I don't need to run FDA and tell them I failed a test, right? I can tell it my engineers, hey, we failed. I can't, rationalize this. I can't use this. We need to retest. Or is it something bigger, right? Is it something that you're not certain what's going to happen, and so you don't want to submit yet, because if you go to FDA and FDA says no, this might take 6 months to mitigate, you might be out of time, right? So your 510K, for example, might be no good. Or another way to say it, you need to call the fire department, FDA, before the fire engulfs your full house and you lose your project, right? Because FDA can show up when your house is fully in flames and they're just going to say, here's your charred house back. Please call us when you build your next home, right? Please call us when you're ready to resubmit. If you engage FDA early and often with a strategy, you're going to have fires, but you're going to have help putting out those fires. And so that's, if I can leave anything with you in my 20 minutes, think of FDA as a partner in the right context, right? They're not always partner, there's some adversarial nature, but if you can utilize FDA in that manner, you're going to be a lot more successful. So my agenda today is, as I've pretty much laid out to you, it's pretty simple. We're going to talk about medical products, more specifically medical devices as it relates to artificial intelligence. And we're going to talk a little bit about thoughts to have on regulations and classifications, thoughts to have when you're thinking about issues and communication strategies, communication considerations when going to FDA. And then I'm also going to include some post-market considerations that I think are really going to creep up in the AI, artificial intelligence and machine learning space when you think about the amount of changes that can occur. So FDA is well aware of artificial intelligence, right? That's no surprise. Mark was already alluding to this. I have a few numbers up here. Between August 1st, 2022 and July 30th, 2023, FDA added 155 AI or ML devices to its tracking list. This tracking list is not all encompassing. This is more just to show the amount, not to give you a final number. And in that year, between 2022 and 2023, FDA expects an approximate increase of 30% year-over-year increase on devices utilizing AI and ML. And so if you look in the history, you'll see a very consistent, at least double-digit growth year-over-year. So FDA has seen more and more AI ML devices. That means they're getting more sophisticated, but FDA will also acknowledge, right, the regulations haven't caught up, right? Congress hasn't created new regulations. There aren't increasingly new standards that the FDA is able to officially adopt. So they're applying old standards to a very new area, right? So that's where communication on your device is going to help FDA frame your product with their current construct. Then I also want to point this out. This won't be something that I'm going to hit on the rest of the talk, but FDA also understands the use of AI in the pharmaceutical manufacturing area. There's predictive results that can have supply and demand and other things. And so recently in September, FDA held a workshop. So if you're interested in that, you should look up and see if you can find that, as well as understand that there's an opportunity for commenting on a discussion paper that was published. And so if you're interested, comments are available to be included through the 27th of this month. So a good opportunity for those companies who are impacted by manufacturing with AI to have your voice heard. So as I've discussed today, my focus really is going to be on medical devices and how to approach FDA. And obviously, given the mechanism of action of medical devices and AI, that's where you expect to see the most back and forth. So when you're going to look into getting your medical device on the market, or even whether it is needed to be on market as far as an FDA standard, consider the following. First, is your medical product actually a medical device regulated by FDA? This is an interesting topic I have with a lot of companies, right? Because many feel very strongly that it's not a medical device at all. I can do what I want to do, right? And I can move forward. And so I'm just showing you this, but we're not going to worry about FDA, right? And so we'll talk about some of the issues that can come up there. And then, does your device utilize AI ML? Are you actually utilizing AI ML to pursue your outcomes from a medical device standpoint? Because that's very important on how you approach FDA. How is your architecture of your full devices environment set up so that FDA is not looking for something that's not there, or they weren't expecting to see AI as part of your regulated component, and now they're seeing the full architecture and it's kind of getting gray whether or not that was part of the regulated environment. And then consider, how is your device classified and what are your potential paths for clearance approval? If you're a 510K and you have a predicate, did your predicate use artificial intelligence? If they do, great. If not, right, how does that impact my review with FDA? How can I investigate that with FDA, and how can I set myself up for success? And then, when and how will you utilize the pre-submission process? To me, this is a really important tool to use properly. By the time I get to submission, I wanted to have utilized the pre-submission process to eliminate as many unknowns as I can, right? Something's always going to creep up, but if I can utilize it smartly, I can help the business on the back end understand both timelines and the testing required. And then, what will be your change control strategy? You may say, what is change control doing in a CLE? Well, if you mishandle change control, you're going to be offering a misbranded or adulterated device into the market. And so making sure that you've got a change control strategy that accounts for AI without having to send every single change to FDA, which is going to bog down companies, is important. So understanding your medical product. When is it truly not a medical device, right? So as I alluded to, a lot of people will say mine's not a medical device. And you'll see in the definition of a medical device, there's actually a carve out specifically for software that performs certain functions. And so you've got to make sure you meet these 4 elements of this software that's not a medical device if you want to truly move forward as not a medical device, right? You get to stay out of 820 documentation. You can avoid quality system aspects as they relate to a medical device. You get speed to market. There's a lot of benefit, but there's also, you're going to have a limit on claims, right? So a lot of times when I'm talking to companies and they'll say, well, my software is not a medical device, the 3rd and the 4th kind of areas of that test are what we're going to be most concerned about, right? Are you supporting or providing recommendations, or are you really just giving steps for the physician to do, right? They'll say, well, I'm just recommending, but there's no other information. What else would the physician do? So you really want to analyze how are you sending information to the physician. And then the 4th, are you providing information for an independent assessment, right? Because there's a lot of secret sauce that goes into AI, that goes into software that companies aren't willing to share, right? And so are you removing that ability to independently assess the recommendations? And if so, you might not fit within this non-medical device designation. And then are you a medical device, but you're in an area where FDA is going to exercise enforcement discretion? Both, I think it was September 28th of 2022, guidances in both areas came out. And so you may be a medical device, but you may fit into this enforcement discretion area, depending on what your AI does, how it interfaces with your software, which is really going to save you a lot of time as far as pre-market submissions. However, that doesn't mean you're not a medical device, right? So you're still going to need those quality system components. So it's going to save you speed to market, but there's a lot of work you should be doing already. And then, do you have a medical device that doesn't fit within the definite, or do you have a medical device as in it's not within that FDA guidance on how to describe your device as not a medical device? And are you not able to use that enforcement discretion? And if so, now you've really got to start thinking of your next steps. So first off, now you're thinking, okay, I do have a medical device. Is my artificial intelligence machine learning part of that regulated environment? Because that's really going to frame how you approach FDA with it. If it's not, right, I'm always going to, in submissions, I might allude to it. I'm going to have very clear architecture showing the non-regulated environment, but I also want FDA to know all the interactions so they don't get confused or think I'm hiding something, right, when I'm really just trying to focus on the regulated portion. And so FDA defines artificial intelligence as using algorithms, models to perform tasks, exhibit behaviors such as learning, and then the last 2 I think are really important when it comes to medical devices, or making decisions and making predictions. So that's a lot of artificial intelligence it's going to do. It's going to help us take data, create some output that says, hey, based on all of these 10,000 patients who have done this before, here's the decision you can make. Or it's going to make predictions. Hey, 58,000 patients were simulated in this model. If you do X implant, we predict an outcome within, this area. And so those are very specific outcomes meant to deliver patient treatment mitigations. And so FDA needs to know that, okay, what's your data look like? How are you going to use those data? How are you gathering those data? How are they controlled, right? All the confines of a clinical study to make sure your data are proper are going to be here. And so if that's the case, if your medical product has AI or ML, make sure you're discussing that with FDA so that they understand the sauce behind your algorithm. And then have a definition of machine learning. I'll skip that, but just understand what FDA is looking for. And if you have AI, ML in your product, really confirm whether it's part of the regulated portion. Now this goes to my last slide a little bit, but don't just assume there's a way to say, well, my AI is doing something out here, and then I pull in the output into my medical device, and now I'm going to move forward and give advice, right? That AI, that algorithm is leading to that decision. So if you create a testing, a VeriVal strategy based on that, and you get in front of FDA, they're going to say, hold up, I need to validate that these numbers are coming out correctly because these are impacting how the patient's treated. Now, is that an end game? No, but if you had known that 6 months earlier, a year earlier, you're going to already have a strategy to account for that, and you're going to be under review by FDA, and you're not going to have that surprise of, oh shoot, I've got a bunch of regression testing, I've got all this testing I've got to do that I don't have time for. And then just that last bullet there, really think about, a lot of these systems are going to have non-medical device components. They might be commercial off-the-shelf components. And how do they interact with your AI? How do they interact with your machine learning algorithms? And what are the inputs that they create? Are they truly just pass-throughs? Or the cloud and you're just a way to store data and send it over? Great, make sure that's in your architecture. So when you go to FDA, FDA doesn't even have a question. They know exactly what you're doing and they know why you're doing it. So, I've kind of talked, all right, we're in a medical device realm right now. So now think about what's my classification is how is that going to impact me moving forward to try to get my device that utilizes AI or machine learning approved. So think about, really this is a very general level, but the FDA classifications, right? Are you a class 1, a class 2 device that's exempt from the pre-market notification process? You still have a lot of controls in place. You still have to have a good quality system, good manufacturing, but you're not likely going to think about the next steps. I talk about the pre-submission process, because if you're really confident in your assessment, you might not need a request for designation, or you might not need some kind of 513G documentation, because you're ready to go in that exempt pathway, and so you're gonna probably not have a lot of engagement with FDA. But are you a class 2 device that requires pre-market notification to get your AI product on the market? Well, as I alluded to earlier, well, what does that mean, right? So now I've got to look at a predicate device, and it's going to have a certain indication, and maybe it's from 2015. And more likely, AI isn't a part of this device yet. So now I've got to say, well, is this indication even accurate for my device, right? I'm trying to use a 2015 that's not using machine learning, that's not using data and inputting it into an algorithm to give me some type of prediction. So do I even have an indication? And then, well, the indication's close enough, and they have a testing strategy, but now my predicate, is it substantially equivalent even? Is my technology so different that I'm about to submit on a predicate that FDA is not going to find convincing at all? And so maybe it's that you have a product that doesn't really have a predicate. So can you take advantage of the de novo process? And now what type of evidence is FDA going to ask for in that de novo, right? So your investors planned for a 510K, a classic 510K, a traditional 510K, and now you're starting to go towards the de novo path because the predicate you thought you had didn't fit. And so now, not even did the predicate not fit, now you might need clinical evidence that you were not going to use before because you had a predicate. So now you can see the costs pile up from a startup concept, or even an established company, right? They give you $50 million for a product. You have to do a $20 million clinical study that you didn't plan for. That eats into it really quickly, and that's how projects can fail. And then, are you a class 3? Are you a PMA device? Great, so maybe you're something like a DBS device, a deep brain stimulation device that's now incorporating AI. Well, you've seen approval pathway for a DBS device, but have you seen it when there's prediction, when there's machine learning that's going to adjust the stimulation based on an input internal to the device? Probably not, right? So how can I talk to FDA to make sure the testing I do, the clinical studies I develop and design are going to capture all of this so that when I'm ready to submit and get approval, I don't have a 2-year delay that I wasn't expecting. Time check. So what does this all kind of lead up to? Well, all of these are inputs into your FDA communication strategy, right? All of these documents, all of these decisions are going to say, okay, maybe I don't need FDA, I don't need pre-market clearance, good. Oh shoot, I'm going for a 510K and I think this is the right process, but I'm not sure. And if I'm wrong, I don't have enough time within the review. I can't do a submission request enough time to actually stop the 510K and still get clearance, right? So now you have to think, how can I mitigate that risk? And to me, a very smart pre-submission process is going to be your best aid in mitigating that risk. So for the first thing I want to talk about is an informational pre-submission. This is an option to start your dialogue very early, and if used properly, you're going to get actually good feedback from FDA. So FDA is in listening mode, right? They're not going to answer questions on a test. You're not going to say, hey, I ran this test for my verification, is that good? They don't have the background, right? But what you're going to do is you're going to have a story with your team. You're going to present that story. You're going to talk about the problem you're solving. What is this going to do to benefit patients, to benefit healthcare providers? And FDA is going to start listening and say, oh, this is the type of device it is. Oh, this is the group that they should be in front of, or these are the individuals that'll best be to speak to. So afterwards, you're going to be able to present your story, and FDA is probably going to follow up and at least say, hey, great presentation. We think you should talk further with a couple of individuals. So now maybe you're only a year into your process on the development of your device, or a year and a half, but now you've already gotten in with FDA and you've already got some names who are willing to help you, right? So that's a major hit, right? You can talk to investors and say, we've been in front of FDA. You can talk to your business leaders and say, hey, we've already started on the path to consider what it's going to take to get on market. And for yourselves, you've already created a conduit to FDA as maybe if I have a quick question, they're willing to answer it instead of me having to go through a 75-day pre-submission. Or do you need a pre-submission to clarify issues, right? If you're going to go and clarify an issue, you don't really ask, what testing do I need? I say, hey, FDA, I've done these 20 tests and we think these are adequate. Does FDA agree? And here's why we've done them, right? And then you allow FDA to focus their feedback and say, oh, those 20 look good. If you had done one more, you would have what you need. And now as a company, you say, okay, great. FDA has given me confirmation that if I do one more verification test, I have the evidence to support the safe and effective use of this device, right? So that's a major win to take advantage of that pre-submission process and have some certainty. Now, as FDA will say, it's not 100% certainty, right? Things can change, but you're going from a 50-50 guess to a 99%. I think I know the answer, and that's a pretty big gain for a business. Other opportunities, I'm not going to touch on these, but think about all the touch points you need. Do you need to help with your classification? Do you have administrative questions? I've been in informational pre-submissions where then the FDA follows up and says, hey, that's great. We see that you're starting on this path to go for whatever it might be, breakthrough designation. Here's some names that can really help you work through this process. Now, they're not going to tell me what testing I need, but they're going to make it easier just to at least get to my next steps, right? So that's another gain. And then ongoing discussion during submissions. I like to get in touch with FDA once I know who my reviewer is, because if I make myself available, instead of getting everything in a deficiency, they might say, hey, I didn't see this document. Do you have it real quick? And I'll send it over. It saves FDA time and it saves my business time, right? So there's a lot of communication, I think, that people want to back off. And I'm not saying call FDA every day and say, is my submission done yet, right? But offer to help and offer to partner with FDA so you can explain what some of the intricacies of your device are so FDA doesn't have to guess. Then the last couple of minutes, FDA communication considerations. Be honest, obviously. I put this on there though because I think people sometimes feel the need to hide from FDA. And I always say you don't need to hide from FDA, but on the next bullet, know what you know and know what you don't. And when I say I don't know something, it gives me a second chance to follow up with FDA. I say, I don't know, but I'm going to get with my expert and I'll reach back out. And when I reach back out, FDA might have formulated another question. So then I can get 2 questions done with that extra reach out, which is really going to smooth my review process. Be on the same page with your team. Really know the story. And I say story, not in the fictional sense, but in the what does your device do and what are you looking for it to do on the market, right? Your device may be the greatest thing, but think about the indications you're going for now, because that's what you want to communicate to FDA. Take advantage of every opportunity and do not fear FDA. FDA is there to partner, right? They want safe and effective treatments on the market for patients. And so make sure you're partnering with them so they can help you do that. Finally, post-market considerations, the AI, the ML space, there's a lot of changes that are ongoing. So acknowledge this, understand and you can build this into some of your submissions too. FDA, hey, if the following components change, we're not going to submit notifications or new 510Ks because here, right? We know that this doesn't affect the device. It doesn't change the intended use. So know your strategy. If you're a 510K, if you're a PMA, know your strategy for change control. Avoid putting adulterated or misbranded devices on. And finally, FDA is familiar with artificial intelligence, though the field is constantly changing and some of the framework which when they work under is not going to be updated nearly in time. So know your device, know how to communicate your device and know what your device does. Have a bold communication strategy for the FDA and take advantage of it and execute to that plan, and always take advantages of opportunities to partner with FDA because you're going to get a lot of valuable information. Your business is going to have more continuity and more predictability, and everyone's going to be a lot happier, right? You're going to get issues no matter what. Fires are going to start no matter what you do, but make sure you put out the ones you can put out and you have FDA help those that you cannot. Thank you for your time. I don't know if there's any questions now. I know Cord and I will have a little bit of time after too, but you know, hopefully you think about this and really craft your FDA strategy because it's really important. And sometimes it's taken into account too late and you've already missed some opportunities along the way. Okay.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, so can you speak to how software architecture influences how FDA regulates or applies their enforcement discretion to non-medical versus medical device software functionalities?
Yeah, so I mean, that's going to be fact specific because of the components. But what the architecture does is it allows FDA to see you've considered the necessary blocks in place, right? So if you have a non-medical device component and you have a class 3 device, you're showing that that non-medical device component, it's not going to influence, it's not going to affect the delivery of the class 3 device. So that stimulation, if you're back to the DBS example, that stimulation is not impacted by what happens to this non-medical device. So that architecture is really the story that FDA is going to rely on to then look for matching evidence, right? So they want to see that, you know, your cybersecurity architecture, all right, you've got your verification evidence. So it's more to tell a story than to classify your device. Individual classifications would be done in different requests, but it's going to be a roadmap.
And I think it would be really important in the internal documentation rationale is if you do decide that it falls under enforcement discretion to have that story documented internally if you ever get questioned.
Yeah, absolutely. You should file regulatory assessments on those various components. And now I'll turn it over to Cord. Thank you.
Nathan, thank you very much. So again, back to the European Union. Now with a regulatory update in EU, Switzerland and UK. It will be relatively short, although a lot of very important things have happened. Let us have a very brief view on the agenda. I will first start with giving you a reminder what the EU medical device regulation is, what is the background, what were the initial transitional periods, and what has happened recently. There was an amendment in March 2023 which provided a great relief to all economic operators in the supply chain, meaning the manufacturer, to distributors, to importers, and also to EU authorized representatives. Before I then come to Switzerland, you all know Switzerland is not part of the European Union, is also not part of the European Economic Area. Therefore, it's a third country in view of the European Union, but nevertheless a very important market. Same for the UK. What is happening from a regulatory side on the UK? How do they secure acknowledgement of CE marked medical devices? I will very briefly touch base on that. And then finally, I will also briefly summarize or give some conclusions that we have concerning software as medical device, which also fall under the category of artificial intelligence systems. So very briefly, the EU MDR amendment. What is the MDR, the medical device regulation? It's a big piece of regulatory law that entered into force 26th of May 2021. It is a regulation, you all know this, you have heard this several times today, so directly applicable in all member states. And to just, or my favorite example to show you how much the regulatory obligations have increased to all economic operators, I'm happy to just name the numbers of the former legal regime, the Medical Device Directive, the MDD, that had 17 articles and 10 annexes, and the EU Medical Device Regulation has now 127 articles and 17 annexes. So if you print this document out, it's a document above 200 pages. So quite a lot to read, a lot of regulatory obligations for all economic operators. What were the initial transitional periods? First of all, you know, we have a different system. We don't, when it comes to the authorization of medical devices, we don't have an FDA, we don't have a formal authority who is granting a marketing authorization. Medical devices in Europe are regulated or dealt with notified bodies. So private bodies that get an accreditation and then are allowed and get the competency to do conformity assessment procedures. So these private bodies need a notification and an official accreditation. And the initial, not the initial, still valid, the transitional period of these notification certifications was about to become invalid 26th of May 2021, by the way. There is a typo on this slide. I'm sorry for that. So we have not a hard deadline when it comes to the marketability of legacy devices. Legacy devices is the term that is used for medical devices which still are placed on the market under the old regime, under the MDDs. These certificates are still valid until they expire. Usually a certificate, a CE certificate, has a validity of 5 years. But the latest, that was the initial transitional period that the MDR was implementing. The latest, these legacy devices can be placed under the MDD CE certificate until the 26th of May 2024. So this was a big concern of all the stakeholders in Europe, these transitional periods, because it was because the Commission could make an impact assessment last year, and they could see that the notified bodies, the number of notified bodies were extremely increasing. And when you reference to 2012, there were 80 notified bodies on the European market. And when you see what to date, how many accreditation or notified bodies we do have, you can have a look on the NANDO database on the European Commission. It's 37, so it's less than 50% what we are having. And when you see how many regulatory obligations came in addition to in relation what the MDD dealt with, you can see that there is really a very time-consuming and intensive conformity assessment procedure to be done by this only 37 notified bodies. Another example why there was a clear need on the market for legislative actions. The impact assessment gave the statistic that until the 26th of May 2024, in total, over 21,000 MDD certificates were about to expire. Having in mind that until October 2022, only 8,000 MDR applications have been filed, and also taking into consideration that the average time of an MDR conformity assessment procedure is between 18 and 24 months, it was an easy calculation example that there will be a huge shortage in supply for medical devices, and there will be risk and health and safety risk for patients in the European Union. So there was a clear call for legislative actions. What happened? Finally, after a long discussion of 1 or 2 years, all the member states and all the industry association asked for it, but there was an MDR amendment effective 20th of March 2023, which significantly extends the transitional periods for the validity of the MDD certificates. So if you have a legacy device which is class 1 to A or 2B, so the risk class, these risk class, then you can still place it on the market under the old certificates until end of 2028. High risk devices such as class 3 and 2B implantable devices can still be placed on the market until 2027. Some of you might have heard about the sell-off period, meaning until when are you allowed to make available legacy devices once they have been placed on the market. This sell-off period has completely been removed, also a great relief for all economic operators that were very concerned about this. So this is the EU MDR amendment, great relief for all economic operators. And now Switzerland, third country in view of the European Union, but very important market. Formally, the CE marks, the EU CE marks have been acknowledged on the legal basis of a mutual recognition agreement. The Commission and the Swiss government had some disputes. When the MDR was entering into force, they were not able to renew this mutual recognition agreement, so that the Swiss legislator had to find other tricks to now confirm the validity of CE marks also on the Swiss market. They have amended the Swiss medical device ordinance also recently with effect of 1st November 2023 to now also apply these extended transitional periods of the EU MDR amendment on the Swiss market. So that's meaning the same periods, the same deadlines apply now also on the Swiss market. You can place your legacy device on the Swiss market on basis of a MDD CE certificate until the end of 2028 or end of 2027, depending on the risk class. I actually forgot to mention that a few conditions have to be fulfilled that you still can place your legacy devices on the EU market. It's not only that you still have a valid CE certificate, MDD CE certificate in place, you also have to have a written mandate in place with a notified body before 20th of March 2023. You must have lodged an MDR conformity assessment procedure application to your notified body, and there should not be any significant change in the design and also in the intended purpose of that medical device. So if these criteria are fulfilled, you can these extended deadlines apply, just for the sake of completeness. UK post-Brexit, also a third country. The MHRA was very reactive on this MDR amendment. They have already in April this year confirmed that the same deadlines will apply when it comes to the acknowledgement of CE marks on the UK market, but they even go a bit beyond. Regardless the risk class, CE marks or legacy devices or any devices with a CE mark can be placed on the UK market until mid-2028, so June 2028. And also they go 2 years above, they are saying, or 1.5 years above, 18 months above. They are saying if a manufacturer has successfully gone through an MDR, conformity assessment procedure, then it's already marketable, this device on the UK market until June 2030. So quite comfortable what's currently happening on the regulatory side in the European Union and also in the Swiss and UK market. So also briefly on software as medical device and artificial intelligence. You all know software can be a medical device. That was still surprisingly, I would say, 12 years ago when the European legislator has implemented this expressly in its medical device directive, saying any kind of software that has a medical purpose is a medical device and therefore does fall under the MDD and now under the MDR. Formerly, generally, software as a medical device was class 1. Now that these software as medical device has received an upgrade under the MDR, they are now generally risk class 2A, by the way. That is the second typo I have to correct. So having in mind, software as a medical device can also be considered as artificial intelligence. And you just learned that the regulatory obligations were exploding. There's now such a catalog for manufacturers of software as medical device that need to be fulfilled under the MDR. And my colleague Oliver already said that there is a draft Commission Artificial Intelligence Act that has been published in 2021. And when you now see that software as medical device can also fall under the definition of artificial intelligence systems, you have 2 regulatory laws that might apply to your device, to your product. That might be a regulatory overkill, in particular since devices which fall under the AI Act will be considered in general as high risk artificial intelligence. And the Article 16 of the draft Artificial Intelligence Act impose additional regulatory obligations, like an additional QMS, quality management system, additional technical documentation that you need to have in place, and you also have to go through a conformity assessment procedure under the AI Act. This might be a regulatory overkill. However, our analysis showed that if you are in compliance with the MDR, you're already in such a mature state that the additional regulatory burdens from the AI Act might not be time consuming, and you might already be in a level that it's only an administrative burden and not a technical or quality burden that you also need to fulfill. So this is the good message I would like to give to you. Not only that's a regulatory overkill, no, if you are MDR ready or mature, or if you have gone successfully through an MDR conformity assessment procedure, you might be relaxed when it comes to the additional AI Act regulatory burdens. In addition to that, it's a very interesting trend only in some member states for the time being. But the German legislator has seen the trend that medical apps are very important tools in the healthcare for patients. And since 2019, so-called digital health applications, digitale Gesundheitsanwendungen, meaning medical apps, are reimbursable under the statutory health insurance system in Germany. So it's a great market that is opening. And yeah, this is mirrored in France since October 2023. There's also 3 degrees in place published, which facilitate the prescription and the reimbursement of digital medical devices. So very interesting. The market remains very attractive for digital health applications in Europe, although there is an AI Act in the legislative pipeline. And yeah, I conclude with this message. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to hear if you have any questions about that. If Amanda?
There's none online. Anyone in the room?
Test.
No? All right.
Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Cord. That was fantastic. We are going to just switch to our panel now, so we'll have a free moment. And if you guys don't mind, maybe moving, the cameraman wants a shot from, so we're gonna have our panel up here. Sorry to kick you out of your seats. Tracy, where would you like them to move? I guess we have Sushana and Jeff coming up here, so maybe, is that okay if they just move right over there? Perfect. And then, of course, after this, we're going to have a light lunch. So hope you can stick around for that. Maybe, I don't know, Tracy, if we'll be allowed out on the terrace. So it's really lovely weather. So that'll be a treat. Sit wherever you guys like. Yeah. I'm going to try and avoid being blinded. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. Oh, and I have these. I'll go just in the order here. Sounds okay. And then we'll just kind of keep riffing. Does everybody have a mic?
Share. Yeah. I don't know who's going first, but.
Sushant. You're up first. I know.
Right.
Give them 1 minute.
And I'll just ask you to introduce yourselves when we're going to start up. Might share a little bit. All right, excellent. Looks like I need a little juice on this mic. Terrific. There we go. Awesome. All right. Thanks for your patience with that transition. I'll just ask Sarah, Jeff, and Sushana to introduce themselves. Maybe we'll start with Sarah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Corain, and I work at Glaukos Corporation. I am vice president there with responsibilities in regulatory, litigation, and intellectual property. I also handle the privacy and cybersecurity aspects, so kind of a lot of things in my role. Glaukos is a ophthalmic company that does medical devices and some combo device drug products. So that's about us.
Good morning. I think it's still morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Dennis. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer at Edwards Life Sciences. I was also somehow suckered into becoming the legal lead for all things AI at Edwards a few months back. So my job is boring these days. Edwards Life Sciences is really focused on structural heart disease. We have a suite of products which include surgical valve replacements as well as transcatheter valve replacements, and then we have a critical care unit which focuses on patients who are in the ICU and need attention through things like Swan-Ganz catheter and a variety of other predictive tools.
Hi, everyone. Sushana Vijaykumar. I am a principal counsel at Medtronic. I support our diabetes group, and my focus includes all things ad promo and clinical studies, as well as the clinical regulatory framework to build on ad promo and emerging trends in social media.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Okay, I will toss the first question over to you, Sushana,
Sure.
and I'll just read it here. What are ways in which business models can lead to privacy considerations, which ultimately can be a trade-off from a sales perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first thing to think of, and it's been mentioned on many slides before as well, is always having a cross-functional alignment before major business decisions, right? And that's just right off the bat for any decision, but especially here. Oftentimes when you're starting off a business model and you're thinking about billing, and this is maybe more specific in the DME space, it's really important to think through, if you're not selling to a hospital, are you going to be utilizing distributors? Are you going to be doing it yourself? And while you're looking at the numbers, and it's typically a financial consideration as well as others, the sales aspect significantly differs because of your consideration of being a covered entity under HIPAA versus not being. And I think while it sounds, obviously, after hearing all of these slides and these presentations, it's very front and center of mind, it really gets drawn out. So the financial considerations might start coming in, and you might decide to only go with distributors or decide to go in-house and sell as a manufacturing company for a DME. And so then your problems down the line become, as you start to market, you might not be able to market the way your competitors are marketing because now you are a covered entity. So now you are looking at a stricter privacy regime, so to speak. You have a HIPAA security risk assessment, and other elements of HIPAA obviously apply. But when you think about it from a marketing perspective, looking at OCR's guidance, for example, that came out December 2022 on tracking technologies, right? So that's specific to covered entities. Maybe the patient information you have, the emails that you'd like to send, that is also restricted by your status as a covered entity. And this is not in any way to say that if you are not a covered entity, it's just a free-for-all. Especially recently. So as was mentioned previously, right, FTC would apply, state privacy laws would apply, but FTC also, there's been a great change. So if you look at I think it was earlier this year, GoodRx, right? So with GoodRx, that's where you see a huge shift from FTC coming in, going after companies for not using health breach notification requirements. And while this was all within FTC's jurisdiction for a while, you didn't see as much activity as you do now. You see FTC and OCR, they've been releasing letters together. I believe the last one was in July 2023 regarding digital technology. So nothing I say is to imply that it's better doing one or the other, but it certainly is a consideration to make early on and to involve marketing and sales and explain to them, here is what marketing and sales will look like if we make this decision, so that they are also prepared accordingly to compete in whatever space you're in.
These are great observations. And I just being at the last couple meetings out in DC that were national type Fiddly, and then the Pharma Congress that Amanda and I attended, we're seeing a lot more FTC involvement these days. It seems like I actually had a regulator on an AI panel last Friday, and I sort of said, I'm seeing a lot more of you guys lately. So it seems like that's somewhat of an intentional approach. So thank you for those comments. Anything to add, Jeff or Sarah?
The only thing that I would add is that one of the challenges that I'm seeing from our marketing teams that I interact with all the time is that they understand at a conceptual level what they need to do in terms of cookies, tags, pixels, cookie banners, et cetera, et cetera. And as we all know, with third-party cookies being deprecated quite rapidly, the question then becomes, how do we get information from potential patients? And I think companies need to take a hard look at their messaging, right? Are we just popping a cookie banner with a bunch of legalese that nobody will ever consent to? Or are we telling our story as a company? Are we inviting them in to be a part of sort of our journey? And I think in my very idealistic mind, that will be a way in which we can continue to draw potential patients in by just helping them understand why we're collecting the information and how it might help them or their families or future generations. So just something to consider.
Thank you. Great. I'll just do a quick follow-up on that, Sushana. So let's say the business model is created,
Sure.
The privacy limitations exist. Where do we go from there? What are the tips to help us to keep sales and marketing strategies within the restrictive privacy framework?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I like about the beginning of that question is we're there, right? What do we do now? Because you might have business people who say, well, why don't we just change? I mean, we're one, why don't we change the way we work? I don't believe the government is going to have such a cheery view of it. So let's say you are a covered entity and you decide to completely disrupt your business model. What you have to realize is the information that you gathered in your large install base was when you were a covered entity. So it's not as simple as, well, let me just change everything and now these rules don't apply. Surely there will be, yes, maybe you might not have to do the same risk assessments that you did, but in terms of your marketing and sales strategy, you're still looking at data you had as a covered entity. So it's tough. So now you're there. What do you do? One tip I see across the board and I recommend is data segregation. I think data segregation is so incredibly important. And what I mean by that is if you get data from somebody, so actually let me step back. If you want to market to your patient and you are a covered entity, you need a HIPAA marketing auth. So if you're emailing them, for example, you are emailing them based off of PHI. So you know they have a specific disease state, they're on one of your devices, you're aware of it, and you are targeting them based on that disease state. And this is not a communication maybe about, hey, your order has shipped or transactional email. This is a pure promotional email. You need a HIPAA marketing auth. And that sometimes is challenging to get a HIPAA marketing auth. It sounds easy, but you might have a customer say, I don't want to sign this, and you can't make it mandatory. And so now you have a marketing and sales team that's like, nobody's reading all of our communications and we have marketing materials. What do we do? So there are some things around it that you can do where you have, maybe you're at a fair, a health fair, and you're getting information. Well, what I recommend is, just as a best practice, get the least amount of information you can, right? Like a name and an email address is much better than more information. And that sounds Yes, of course, right? That's like less PHI. But the problem is oftentimes you have sales teams especially who want to get more information because these can be seen as leads, right? And so potentially these are people you'd want to target very specifically to send emails that go towards them. Well, that's then just a balance you have to make. So now you have all of this information in your system. They may or may not own a device, but you don't have any data segregation. So if a regulator comes in and looks at your systems, you have data from tons of people, you have all of their disease state, going out of your way to say, well, this person bought this device and this person didn't, and I can't segregate it, would be a large mess. So I would really recommend getting less information if they're not your patient. Even when they are your patient, segregating them as much as you can so that when a regulating agency does come in, hopefully you won't need that, but just in case, you can show how different you have kept people who truly are your customers, who are not your customers, who have not bought your device, what information they have, and the less information they provide, the more you can argue that it was permissible to market to them. And so those are just some tips to try and do as much as you can in a restrictive environment.
That's very insightful, because having worked with a lot of commercial folks on contacting patients, I mean, whether it's a bill and buy and build type model or a DME model, they're drastically different requirements, and usually your marketers really aren't going to know about them unless they've been educated already or read your policies, right? So those are great points. I don't know if you want to add anything. Okay, I'm going to go on to the question for you, Jeff. From a privacy perspective, what are some of the risks associated with wearable devices and other types of technical devices?
Sure, thanks, Mark. I think in large part, the challenges and risks you've already heard of or heard about earlier today, right? It's what are we collecting? How are we collecting it? Why are we collecting personal data? What are we doing with it? Who are we sharing it with? How are we going to secure it? And how long are we going to keep it, right? Those are all very typical problems that you have when you collect any personal data. With wearable devices, collecting sensitive health information, now you've got issues related to notice, transparency, consent. You're not going to be collecting health data from EU citizens without their consent. In California, under the CCPA, folks have a right to control and limit the use of their sensitive personal health information. So all these need to be taken into account, not just at the back end, but really at the front end, I think, of wearable device production and development. I had a client in my former outside counsel life that wanted to do some surveys, including wearable devices around the world. And when I asked the client what would they be collecting, I was told, well, just pulse information. We're gonna measure heartbeat. That's it. I said, that's it? That's it. I said, let's schedule a call with your engineers, because I can guarantee you that's not everything that you're collecting. And after a conversation where we found that they were collecting much, much more, including precise geolocation information, we changed our approach. And what was a global rollout quickly became a truncated rollout to specific regions where consent and personal health information issues weren't quite as great. No, we did not go to Germany. That would have been a really bad idea at the time. So, you have to think about these devices that they are a little bit unique. You've got signals that are bouncing off of cell towers, Wi-Fi systems, GPS signals. And so you really run the risk of a couple of things. One, that this information is passing through Wi-Fi channels that are not secured. My favorite is anytime you go to the airport and you pull up the Wi-Fi signal and you see the FBI channel. Never a good idea to join that one. But this is the kind of issue that happens, right? And it also can trigger geolocation concerns that folks don't think about when they're developing these. I think we all need to understand, and Sushana, hit on it, is that the FTC is really interested in health information. There was a blog that they put out a couple months ago that something about Baker's dozen from the FTC regard to health information. If you haven't read it, I strongly suggest you do, because they lay out a roadmap of what they're looking for and what they're focusing on. And again, recall that a lot of this is driven by the Dobbs decision and the concern to really protect reproductive rights and locations and the like. But it's only getting worse, quite frankly. And so in the healthcare industry, especially medical devices, if you're working with wearables, you need to be aware that the FTC is watching very closely. And so there's a higher level of attention, I think, that needs to be made, excuse me.
Yeah, it sort of seems, and if anyone wants to speculate on this with me, that the FTC is sort of getting set up for what ultimately will be the regulator for some sort of forthcoming law. That I know, talking with Paul over the last several years, he's like, yep, there's bills in committee, but they're not getting out of committee. Now we're going into an election year, so probably no major federal GDPR-like law coming to the United States, but it is sort of interesting to just see the FTC come in more and more. And I would assume that they would probably be the regulator, right? Because I don't think this will be bigger than OCR, obviously. So at any rate, thank you for that, Jeff. All right, Sarah, I'm gonna toss one your way. So we've talked a lot about AI today. And the question is, what advice would you give to companies? I'm sure we have some here in the audience that are just starting to develop connected devices and AI technology for the healthcare industry.
Yeah, so I think I would really recommend lawyers to get involved early at the design phase, to really start working with the R&D folks to figure out, okay, what is their ultimate objective? What are they trying to collect? Are they collecting more than they need to? And just really work with them at the initial stages to kind of explain to them the different avenues and where it's going to take them. Are you now going to be a medical device because this is the way you're structuring the device and how you're collecting information and what you're doing with it? Are you going to be, subject to potential consents from patients and various things like that because of the way you're collecting the information? Where will that information be stored? Are you going to be storing it on your servers? Is it going to be stored on a cloud? Is it going to be just on the wearable? How does it get transmitted to a doctor or whoever else needs to see that information? So this is all information that I think we need to, as lawyers, get involved with early and help the team understand as they're creating the device, if it's at all possible. I think there also needs to be a real thorough consideration of data collected. So I think in the next, 30 to 50 years, data is going to be gold. It's going to be, everybody wants it. It already is to some extent. I think it will be even more so in the future. So the question becomes, okay, as a company, of course we want more data, but there's storage limitations, there's issues with how you store it, there's security concerns. And then there's the issue of, okay, well, you have to have an objective for the data you're collecting based on a lot of the privacy laws out there now. So why are you collecting it? How much of it do you really need? And can you limit that? So I think we really need to be looking at that from the onset of what are we collecting? What is good for our business? And we have to value that versus really what's necessary for our purpose. So bringing those two together is often challenging. I find that in our company, we have this immense desire to run a million different reports for different things and see patterns and see this. And so the data, they want to do all kinds of things and they want to de-identify it and then run all kinds of reports on it. So I understand that business need, but at the same time, we have to be really careful about what data we do have. Is it really being de-identified? Where is it being stored? Who's having access to that? And then lastly, I think, we really obviously have to think about the cybersecurity. And I know that's come up a lot, but that's really kind of going to be the biggest aspect of data in the future, especially for the medical device sides, because we're going to have such sensitive information in our possession. And we have to really make sure that the structure is sound from top to bottom.
Yeah, and Mark, if I could just add one thing, I think Sarah really raises some key considerations to think through. The other one that I've been struggling with, quite frankly, is getting leadership buy-in. When my GC came to me and bestowed the, I don't know what you want to call it, the burden or the opportunity of becoming the AI legal lead for Edwards, in our conversation, he said to me, he said, you know, I'm a little concerned about AI because, you know, we're starting to use it. And I said to him, well, we've actually been using it for about a decade, maybe longer. And I think what's happening at the leadership level is that there's just a lack of understanding. So we've got to define what we mean when we're talking about AI. He was talking about generative AI, right? He was not talking about, you know, the other, I don't know, 10 levels of AI, which are broader than just generative. So I think educating our leaders, helping them understand where we're using AI, where we might have risks versus areas where we're not going to have as many risks. I mean, I can't type a text or an email without AI suggesting what I should say next, and it's generally wrong. And when I swipe and then send without looking at it, I get in big trouble, usually with my wife. But so it really, leadership buy-in and education, I think, is a really key component when you're starting a program.
And I think I'll add to that just on the same note, which is a part of, you know, the AI that's not in your medical device, but just AI being used within your company. Really important to look at it and see what policies you need to put in place. I know in our company, we went through our information security policy. We've added language about AI and the use of AI within the company. So we really need to be thinking about, okay, what our folks out there are using AI. There's no doubt about it. You know, our teams are using AI for the work they're doing. So the question becomes, are we going to be a company that completely restricts it and we say that we restrict it, but know that they might be using it anyway? Or are we going to be a company that allows it to some extent and puts some boundaries around what can and cannot be done? And so, you know, we took the approach of, okay, it can be used, but here's the boundaries. And some of the key things to think about is, well, confidential information, business confidential information should not be included in a generative AI situation unless you know where that data is going. But if you're using ChatGPT, there should be no reason to put personal information or confidential information into that. So we had like a question from our HR team that asked, hey, you know, we want to use it to create something for our AI policies or AI information that they want to disseminate. And it was really important to work with legal to see, okay, well, what are you going to put in there? Because we want to make sure that anything you put does not disclose anything confidential to the company. So those are the other things I think to really think through is policy generation for the company generally.
Yeah, I kind of had that moment, as probably we all did, when somebody was, I know it was my son about a year ago that said, hey, there's this cool ChatGPT. And I'm like, what is that? And he's like, oh, they're students at Wisconsin are already writing their papers with it and whatnot. And I'm like, okay. But I remember first using it and checking, you know, putting some things in, and I'm like, well, where is this going? You know, so as we have a lot of lawyers here, you know, I think that's a really practical point, that be careful with what you put in there. Who knows where it's going to end up? If you're putting attorney-client privilege information that you don't want the world to know about, obviously that should not be going into the black box on the internet. Anything to add, Sushana? No? Or yeah?
No, I think that's right. I mean, we're doing the same thing with our policies. The concern about confidential information going in. The concern also that, do people need our devices? Or are they just going to try and use ChatGPT to figure out predictive analytics? So absolutely, same going on in the industry.
I know last week, before I spoke on this panel, I typed into Bard, which is Google's AI function, which works really well, actually. I said, you know, I have a suspicious mole. Do I have cancer? What do I do? And then it spit back out like, you need to go see a doctor. And so it's like, we're not giving you legal advice or medical advice. So, you know, some lawyer at Google figured that out.
I think that the generative AI concern is a legitimate one, right? I think most folks are familiar with what happened with Samsung and their engineers releasing their secret code into the wild, which is never a great thing to happen. And of course, in response, what has happened is that the AI developers have come up with enterprise solutions, which in theory don't allow any information that's inputted to escape your organization. And so that's sort of the next step. I have strongly encouraged our employees that even if we have an enterprise tool in place, which we do, it is good practice to not enter personal information, confidential information, trade secrets, intellectual property, because again, there are no guarantees, and we want to teach them good practice, right? Because they can go to their personal computer, get to OpenAI and put in whatever they want, and we have no visibility at all into that. And so I think training our employees with sort of the challenges, putting up the appropriate guardrails is a really important step in sort of trying to tame generative AI, if it can be tamed.
Well said. Any questions from the audience? I have a few more here.
You have a few online.
A few online, okay. And time check, can we get a time check also, Tracy?
So 12.
And we're going up until
15 minutes.
15 minutes. That's
All
what I
right,
thought.
here's
Thanks.
one. If you have patient consent, can you collect and store as much data as you want?
I mean, it depends. It depends on privacy laws, and so it depends on what laws you fall under, whether it's GDPR, HIPAA, or state laws. But a lot of the privacy laws that are coming out say that you have to have a purpose for it. It has to be privacy by design in the GDPR. So there's a lot of reasons why you can't just collect everything you want, and you really do need to narrowly tailor that for a legitimate purpose.
Yeah, my only add-on was that would be you don't want that much data, because it's just increasing your attack surface. The more personal data you have. Now, having said that, if you can somehow anonymize it permanently, and you can use it for a whole lot of functions, but you better be darn sure that you've done what you need to do to make sure that data can never be re-identified, because you're setting yourself up for disaster.
All right, there's one more. What about paywall or enterprise versions of ChatGPT that allows ownership of and confidentiality of content generated by such systems?
Yeah, I think that was sort of what I alluded to earlier. The enterprise solutions appear to be effective. And it's interesting because they're just the base enterprise level generative AI. Once you enter in your prompt, it's gone. It is whatever your prompt was is not recorded, it's not kept. It goes out into the World Wide Web and pulls everything that it can and gives it back to you. But your information, your question doesn't. The Copilot tool, which is coming out or is out and will continue to evolve, is one which allows companies to have the enterprise tool, but the Copilot allows the enterprise to learn within itself. So if you put in prompts, it won't go out into the wild, but it will be contained in your enterprise tool. So Copilot is an interesting add-on. And again, I think we're seeing corporate America in large part dipping their toe into AI before they dip their whole foot and before they jump in, because nobody wants to lead the charge. That it's sort of, I always tell people, nobody wants to be the Samsung of AI, just like no one wanted to be the Sephora of privacy. So.
Well, that makes sense. Anything to add from the other panelists? No? I know just one thing that popped into my head there was in reaction to your comments, Jeff. We won't say the name, but Amanda and I were talking to someone at this out in DC a couple of weeks ago, and I think they spent $10 million on there. And I think actually they were talking about it from the podium, so we probably could say their name, but for an AI, was it a chat? Yeah.
Like the enterprise, like a ChatGPT version for the company, yeah.
And I think I can't remember if customers were interacting with that.
No, it was just internal,
Okay.
yeah.
So, I mean, that would be the kind of logical progression, right? Is that your customers get it, and then you could say, hey, you're going into this case. Hopefully your cardiologist or vascular surgeon or whatever, brain surgeon knows everything they need before they go into a case, but would there be an opportunity there for a company to say, well, actually, we have all the things
we
you
don't
need.
need
sell
reps
them all.
anymore. You can use our ChatGPT.
And if you buy them all, we'll give you this discount the more you buy. I mean, there's the sales and marketing people are going to get a hold of this, I think, ultimately, and do things that none of us are thinking about right now. Any more questions online? I think we have about 10 minutes left or so. So I'll
one in here.
Okay.
Oh boy, it's Danny.
Oh, it's Danny. All right. Danny, maybe introduce yourself to the group briefly, if you wouldn't mind, because I know when you registered, I was like, This guy knows more than all of us about, for sure, AI, and hopefully we can teach him a couple things about the law.
For sure. Yeah, no, thanks for having me. My name is Danny Kiase. I'm on the research faculty at Cedars-Sinai here. It's a health system. I've developed and do develop AI algorithms for healthcare applications, in the heart space, electrocardiogram, currently in the surgical domain, using surgical videos to train surgeons to become better versions of themselves and so forth. So that's a brief intro about me.
Thank you.
My question is, you guys represent, or you all represent large-sized companies. Apart from the data, what are some of the challenges that have been put on your desk that are perhaps an early stage company, or you would encourage folks to consider early on before it even gets to your point, or like, okay, we need to seriously discuss this? Could you maybe touch on 1 or 2 points internally to the extent possible?
And I'll just throw out a disclaimer for all of you. They're here on, their personal behalf, and all of their beliefs and words are their own personal beliefs, right? Not your company's. But yeah, perhaps you can respond to Danny a bit.
The one thing that I would say, Danny, is that it doesn't matter what size company or enterprise organization you're part of, you need to put in some very basic governance tools that are, readily available on generative AI platforms. But in all seriousness, put some guardrails up, put a group together that can actually, I think, talk through the various AI platforms or tools that you want to use. I think having a cross-functional team, in a small organization, it's not going to be what we would have, but drawing in resources who think a little bit differently. And I actually was at a conference last week in Boston where they were talking about these AI review boards, this concept, and saying even bringing in folks from the outside, people like philosophers who look at AI and where it can, in a completely different way, certainly than lawyers do, and certainly different than engineers do, right? But just to keep that perspective and have these conversations, because it doesn't matter how big you are, you still need to have the conversations about it.
I mean, I think similarly, I think it's important to start thinking about the different aspects of, like you said, it's not cross-functional because you might not be big enough to have cross-functional, but the different aspects of your device and what it's going to touch. So you're going to look at, okay, well, this device touches the patient this way, and what aspects of that do I need to look into and to regulate, or to make sure that I have the proper laws, all the functions that are there. And then, okay, well, this is how it touches the customer, and what's being transferred there. How do I address that? So in the customer scenario, is there privacy concerns? Is there cybersecurity concerns? Is there any other issues that regulatory concerns that I need to be addressing for the HCP context? And so I feel like kind of looking at them bucket by bucket, that's the way you start addressing the little problems. And then you can, I think, get your mind around, okay, well, maybe I haven't done this part enough and I need to look into it more. And I think that's, even because we're not quite as big as these companies. And so for us, it's a lot of times is just kind of looking at the path we're on in that particular relationship and trying to think through what are the different things that could be touching it. And do I know enough about that, or do I need external help to address that?
Yeah, and I think what's really important, and when I think about your question, right, I wasn't thinking as specifically on privacy, cybersecurity. Of course, that's the main topic, but just in general, what comes to our desk as the number one concern or complaint. And I would say it's a lack of, it's not just cross-functional alignment, but understanding of what is the risk when things go awry, right? So I think it's really important at the very beginning. So you have a device, maybe you're creating a device, you're thinking of your business model. How are you going to sell it? It's also important to think, I mean, it's like start to finish to the end, to if something goes wrong, what are your civil monetary penalties that you might have? Are you financially stable enough to hold that? I mean, is your whole company going to be wiped out if something goes wrong? What is the risk? And it's that type of risk assessment that truly needs just an analysis. And I will say that sounds easy, but it's It rarely happens. And it starts with, we had the conversation, I believe Nate was having it on the regulatory framework right there, right? Do you want to be, is this going to be class 3? Is this going to be a class 2 device? Are you looking at a 510K, a PMA? What's the difference? Well, why does it matter? Do you have enough substantiation to make the claims that you want to make? Do you have maybe another device that's out there and you're telling FDA my device is close enough? Well, what risk does that lay to you? Then after you have your device, did you do the right clinical study? Now you can't substantiate your claims. Now you can't market. And I think what happens is that we make business many companies make business decisions based very reactionary decisions, as well as decisions that are not long-term thinking and very short-sighted. And that's where you get into these concerns. And I would say the number one concern I ever get on my desk is, I didn't realize we'd have to pay this much money. Why was I not informed? I didn't realize this was going to happen. So-and-so didn't make it seem so scary, so to speak, right? And so it's just having that entire cross-functional risk assessment done beforehand of everything from start to finish.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, and now I'm going down a complete rabbit hole, Mark, so I apologize.
I love it.
I apologize ahead of
Rabbit
time.
holes, great.
But one of the challenges with AI and risk management, and I agree with Sushan that you absolutely have to do it, but the challenge is there really aren't a whole lot of rules, regulations, and laws that are out there that can tell you, hey, if this happens, here's the consequence, right? I mean, we have the pending EU AI Act. I think, once it gets through Trilog, I think we'll have a real, we'll obviously have something that will be sort of a standard. You can't really talk AI this week without talking about the White House's executive order that came down last week and what it sets, particularly in the healthcare space with the HHS AI task force that they have to somehow put together in less than 30 days. Good luck. And so without those rules and regulations, one comment is I think that's why they have so many privacy people now and responsible for AI, because we're used to this. We're used to trying to look around corners in terms of what's coming next, and it's a challenge. And so that's one of the things that makes it sort of the fun in a way, right? Because we can actually all play a part in shaping how these laws evolve. And for those of us who are lawyers, we weren't around to shape property law back in England, 1,500 years ago. So this is our chance.
This is our chance. Did you have a comment, sir? No. Yeah, no, it is really wild to kind of watch it. I know Wild Wild West is we're in the West, kind of overused cliche, but it does feel that way right now. I mean, having kind of, again, been in a lot of conferences the last several weeks in a row, it's this discussion, it's very similar elsewhere. And the fact that we are kind of learning it as we go. I mean, there's lots of guidance from the FDA, but it's open to interpretation. The FTC is weighing in, again, open to interpretation. It's different than what we're seeing in Europe, for example, or China or other jurisdictions where they're really more locking things down from my view. I know, Cord, you got my attention earlier when you said personal liability for the managers running these companies, and there is personal accountability under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and for executives, especially under the responsible corporate officer doctrine. But we're seeing, I don't know if this is a fair characterization. I think Europe is somewhat more open to enforcing these rules, where in the United States, I do think politics enter the equation, and it's harder to hold people to account sometimes, depending on who their friends are. But so there's not really a question there, just more me rambling on. But I do think it's, I heard this also, just that, there's sort of this period where we don't have the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act changed yet. I know this executive order is coming out, but as we all know, those are sort of hard to enforce for the government. So I do think we'll see congressional action. And maybe just to throw like a curveball out to all of you, because we didn't discuss this when we rehearsed, but do you see anything coming down the pike for congressional action on any of the things we've discussed today?
Given the way Congress has acted the last decade, I think they're going to try to put some guardrails up. I'm not sure that they'll be successful. I do think that, you know, while I said there aren't really rules, regulations, laws which are specifically for AI, you know, the FTC and other governmental agencies have made it very clear that just because you're using AI, you're still subject to all their laws, and so you can't just go off the deep end. I do think that at some level they will find something that they can agree upon, right? Whether it's something related to generative AI and children, that always seems to be someplace where, you know, with COPPA and eventually COPPA 2.0 and 3.0, yeah, they can find some middle ground, but it gets challenging. I mean, Sean asked the question earlier about preemption. I mean, the issue of preemption has derailed federal privacy law for the last several years, and if you can't get that one right, you know, it's going to be very challenging with these new technologies. And part of the problem is the folks in Congress don't understand it. It's a challenging crowd to turn, I think.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of agree that I think they will definitely try. I think it's a hot topic. I think everyone's talking about it. And I think that most people feel like there's a need for regulation of AI. So I think there's going to be some amount of consensus on the fact that regulation is needed, but, you know, whether they can all agree on what it is, we'll see.
They may just kick it over to the FTC and we'll just it will become law as we go forward.
Right, yeah, maybe they'll just use their rulemaking authority to say, well, this law applies, and we'll just let someone try and bring a APA case against us that disagree with us. But yeah, just last point I'll make, and then we'll wrap up here. But back in Minnesota, we're getting a bit of buzz right now because there's MedTech 3.0. And so on one hand, you have this sort of pressure saying from regulators, FDA, FTC saying, you know, be careful with with AI and ML and everything. But on the other hand, we're going to designate Minnesota, and they've done this with other tech hubs, as a center that they want to push data science, MedTech, and patient care together to actually help the US lead in this space. So I don't know, I feel like our government, I know that it's easy to criticize any government, but I do feel like Jeff Shurn, for example, who's leading CDRH at FDA, which is the device branch, he's been in that position since 2009, I believe, and I think he gets it right most of the time, and I think he's going to be heavily influential in where we go with regulating AI, and I think he already has been. He sees it coming down the pike right now, and I know Danny and I were talking about this briefly earlier. One of the critiques is that it's hard for makers of AI to get good data because who owns it? And then if you're using someone else's to build your AI, or do they somehow own part of your device? Do you owe them money? But I kind of wonder if NIH will open up some of its databases to provide developers with the information they need to make sure so that they get the device right with the AI triage for stroke in that story I told at the beginning of the day, and avoid the sepsis situation, you know. So, well, with that, please join me in thanking the panel, and we'll have some appetizers.